It's Halloween in the Rust Belt community of Oil City. 12-year-old Shauna Howe is leaving a Girl Scout party. Her best friend offers to walk her the extra block home. Shauna goes it alone. She would never be seen alive again. And Halloween would change forever.
I used to love Halloween. I used to love to dress the kids up. Shauna loved Halloween, too. She loved trick-or-treating. She loved just anything to do with it. That year, she wanted to be a gymnast. I remember that morning, Shauna come over and she says, Mom, I've got the Girl Scouts tonight. We've got the Halloween thing. We're going up to the nursing home.
She got dressed in her outfit. She had tights on and a bodysuit, and she had gloves on her arms, I believe.
She gave me a kiss and a hug and told me she loved me. And then she was gone. And that was it. They got out of Girl Scouts at between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Shauna and Joey L had left together. Nobody was there to pick up Shauna because I forgot. They come out of the alley where the Girl Scout meeting was, and at the corner there, Joey L went straight down, and Shauna made the left and was coming up the street.
I was looking for her as it was getting dark. I believe the time changed just that week or so. And Lucy calls, and I said, you know, Shauna ain't home yet. What time's that Girl Scout stuff? She says that should have been over.
I started getting worried. I mean, even the latest party for the Girl Scouts wouldn't last that late. I told John to call like the hospitals to see if there'd been any type of accidents or anything, because I didn't have a cell phone. But by the time I got home, it was 10 o'clock. There's no way she'd have been out there that long. And that's when I started panicking. I just called the police. The police showed up. They come to the house.
Maybe she was lost. Maybe she stayed at a friend's. I think that was the hope. And then other reports started coming in.
You know, they have the little walkie-talkie things, and there was a squeaky thing on there. They had this guy, Peyton, at the police barracks, and he's saying that they seen the girl being taken. And that's how I found out that Shauna was kidnapped.
Dan Payton was walking on West First Street in Oil City. He saw a little girl walking on the other side of the street. He then sees a tall, skinny guy wearing a ball cap. He hears a short scream.
She was grabbed and taken into a car that left immediately. Dan thought it was a small red car.
This is before the cell phones. So then he now, at 8 o'clock at night, has to knock on doors to have somebody call the police station.
I was a patrol officer on the night shift, 11 at night till 7 in the morning. We got called in to help look for Shauna Howe. There's a lot of emotion involved. There's a little girl missing. How could this happen? It was almost unbelievable. One of our children was missing.
Right away, we set up a roadblock. You stop people, you talk to them, you ask them if they'd seen anything suspicious.
Everybody's looking. Early on, at least 20 to 30 law enforcement officers looking for Shauna. We're looking everywhere. We're talking to people on the street, going back over again to the intersections, the area. We start to look for the vehicle. Driving the streets, just literally doing grid patterns up and down every street, every alley. There was that urgency and that concern. After 24 hours, the likelihood of finding them alive decreases almost by the minute.
We knew nothing. Just wandered the house all night long. I don't remember sitting down. I remember when the light broke the next morning, word got out everywhere. And I remember looking out the window. There's all these people in my front yard. A lot of them were friends, family. There were some people I didn't even know.
Local people started gathering to go out and do their own searches.
That's how this community responds. There were hundreds of people out, volunteers, just walking and looking. The general consensus was fear. And the pressure to bring that child home for the community and the parents was unbelievable.
I wanted to go out and search. You know, the cops are like, no, stay here in case somebody calls. What if it's a kidnapping, you know, and they want a ransom or something? So they wouldn't let me out of the house. You ever see like a cage lion just walking back and forth and back and forth? That's what that living room feels like. It's like walking around in circles because there's no place else to go. You just want to scream at the top of your lungs. Just let me out. But nobody would.
Coulter's Hole. It's a hunting area, some swimming. It's secluded, it's private. People go out there to drink maybe alcohol underage, use drugs, those type of things.
In that area, there are some camps. And one fella was driving away from his camp to go home, and he noticed something under a bridge.
We got a call that they found something, and they specifically wanted me to identify it. I walked up to it and took a close look at it. There in the bush was her bodysuit. It had been there like overnight. The moisture was like on it.
I was on patrol duty at the time. I was called down to the scene. When I arrived, I learned what had been discovered. It now had become very serious. They tested the gymnastic suit. There were several sentinel deposits on the suit.
I'd known that with the gym clothes being there that way, that she'd been raped or molested somehow.
The lab in Erie knew that they had a semen stain, and there was enough on there to get DNA. As long as Shauna's missing and we don't know where she's at, there's a chance that we might be able to find her.
You always want them to come back alive. And until you prove to me that she's not, we're looking for her like she is.
The day after the bodysuit was found, we were at the station and a call came in. This guy had gone to a nearby cottage down by Coulter's Hole. And he said, I just walked out on the bridge and I looked down and there she was. She wasn't there the day before because we were out there.
Her shoes were found on the bridge. And there was a candy wrapper in close proximity. The area was combed by law enforcement the day before, and then she's found there at daylight, clearly indicating that the kidnapper had went back in during the dark with the child and then killed Shauna and disposed of her body there. To have the veracity to go into that area with the victim on the opportunity of getting caught. It was a taunt. Just like the shoes on the bridge. The likelihood of those shoes being found on the bridge, one facing one direction, one facing the other, and not falling off the bridge, it was placed there. And that denotes a sophistication that is not common among criminals. So, who killed Shauna Howe? Somebody was toying with us. Look what I did. Can you catch me?
The body's found on a Friday. It was dark. And from where the body was, there's nothing from there until the next roadway. It was a little girl. She was thrown from the trestle, which was over 33 feet high, down to the creek bed. There was, of course, physical evidence of injuries that she sustained. Her knees were scuffed and scraped. We believe that she was alive when she was thrown from the trestle. She was alive probably for 5-10 minutes, something or other, before she died. You know, I'll never forget what happened to her.
So I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I hear clump, clump, clump coming up the steps. My brother Keith literally falls in my lap and says, it's Shauna. I'm like, no, it can't be. It just can't. And Claire wraps his arms around me, and he says, it is, sis. I seen her. And I said, no. And I lost it.
Lucy started crying and let out a wail that I'll never forget. I mean, it's one of those wails that goes to your soul. You know what it is. It speaks to something very primal in you. And it's the wail of a mother losing her child.
They canceled Halloween. People were keeping a real close eye on their kids. They weren't letting them out. When you have a body of that little girl, it's hard not to get a little bit emotional, but you have to look at it objectively too. We had DNA. That was the start.
It was a blood hunt.
If this case was going to be solved, you had to find a match for that DNA.
A stranger abduction is more rare than an abduction from someone that knows the victim. So you have to look first at the family.
We DNA tested her stepdad, John Brown. We DNA tested the uncles. We looked at him hard, okay?
They even wanted a DNA test for my son. And I looked at him and I said, "You want what?" And of course they're saying it's to eliminate him. Finally, John got me calmed down enough, and Carrie, John's like, "Mom, just let me do it."
Yeah, we took a DNA sample from the boy. He was probably old enough to ejaculate. You have to start getting into everybody that she was involved with. We got into her school looking for admirers, anything like that. Went through all of the Girl Scouts and their parents.
It was an intense search. There was nobody not looked at.
But we never got a hit. I felt like I was leaving a stone unturned, you know what I mean? That night, we knew that she was grabbed and probably taken into a car. There was a description of a tall, thin guy in a small red car. One of the people we were looking at was Bill Crabtree, the guy who found the body. What was he doing out there? Is he trying to throw everybody off? He was driving a small red car.
They went through the vehicle, they looked for evidence. Obviously, they got his DNA. None of that matched.
But then somebody called in and said that the description fit the guy named Ted Walker.
Ted Walker met Shauna at the pizza shop. If Walker was working, for some reason, he'd always want to give the girls a hug. And the girls would run from Walker so that he couldn't touch them.
We know he's familiar with the family and that he had a small red car.
But eventually the DNA cleared him too.
So many dead ends. Looking at family, friends, other possible motives. It just came up blank.
One of the main things I did was to interview folks around the neighborhoods where Shauna lived who had not been thoroughly investigated. Now, Michael Pruitt came under suspicion because he lived just a couple of doors down from the location of the abduction. Very suspicious guy. The day after her corpse was found, he got on a bus and left town. He became top of the list as far as potential suspect.
Michael Pruitt's house was searched.
There was a cubby hole that had been described to us. Shauna, at autopsy, she had injuries to her knees. They were scuffed and scraped. She was kept somewhere. This cubby hole would have been a good place where a child could have been contained.
Somebody would have had to keep Shauna alive for 3 days. Michael Pruitt's house was searched.
We looked at him very, very hard.
The primary focus was on this cubby hole that he had beneath the stairway. When his DNA didn't match, believe me, that everybody was upset.
There were at least 100 DNA samples taken in this investigation.
Back then, you couldn't get a DNA sample with a swab. We had to take them in for blood tests. Anybody that I looked at hard, I got DNA samples from them.
There's a reason they took 100 DNA samples. That was somebody that somebody was looking at and saying to themselves, here's our suspect. The list was going on and on and on.
You didn't do anything wrong. Let's get your, let's get your name out of it. I couldn't tell you how many of those we did over that couple of years period. All the DNA tests came back negative. It was negative with all of them. It was negative with all of them.
I'm on my night off. I get a call from Officer Tom McClellan. He said, Winter, we need you down here. Somebody just tried to abduct a girl. I said, what? They tried to kidnap her. They beat her up pretty bad. She's down here. I need you down here. She was walking down the street. He stalked her. He followed her out and tried to bushwhack her. It's a violent attack. And they're trying to put somebody in the trunk of a car who's capable of doing something like this. Jimmy O'Brien is. Tim and Jim O'Brien were brothers. Timmy older than Jim. There wasn't a cop here that didn't know the O'Briens. They're sexually violent offenders. Jimmy in particular. The guy's evil. The victim said, I just know if I'd gotten in the trunk, I'd be dead. So I fought with everything I had. I arrested Jimmy for attempted kidnapping. This crime. It was on the same route that Shauna had walked home. It was on East 2nd Street, the same area she had left and went through. We're still having our meetings about Shauna Howe. And I said, have you looked at the O'Briens?
We knew who the O'Briens were. I arrested both of them many times, but they couldn't have done Shauna's kidnapping because they had been in jail when that occurred.
There still were no answers. I had bought a computer and got the internet, and they had that thing on there where you could go and see where all the pedophiles were around you and stuff. And when I pulled that up, I got the shock of my life of how many pedophiles lived around me. The person that took my daughter and killed her could be walking up and down the street in front of my house, and I wouldn't know it.
Around Halloween, we always had extra patrols. Because when you don't know who did it, you don't know when they'll do it again. That killer's still out there. There's always dread every time a child came up missing for 30 minutes and you found him at the neighbor's. Oh my gosh, did this happen again? It was the 5-year anniversary of the day they found Shauna Howe that Shanae Freeman came up missing out of her backyard. 5-year-old little girl, gone, disappeared. The family looks for a period of time before they call us. So it is going from dusk to dark. Darkness conceals a lot of evil and a lot of things.
That's 5 years later, there's still no arrests, there's still no suspects. So the fear kicked back in again. Are they at it again?
When I came down to the station, there's hundreds of people waiting outside, wanting to hear something. There was fear. There's nothing but fear that gripped the community. How could this happen again? I was thinking about Shauna Howe. I asked God, get me on my best game, man. Give me help. Because that same fear was still there. It's getting dark. The boogeyman's out there. He's back.
We heard that another girl had went missing. That brought up the idea of, could it be connected? Because it was around Halloween time too. And we decided to go and help that family because their daughter was missing, their child was missing.
There was a tremendous amount of pressure put on those persons investigating this case, but we had a whole different game. We were ready here. Search was immediately put underway. We had no eyewitnesses that observed her abduction. So we wanted to talk to anyone that was in the search party or around the scene at the time of the incident. There was a young man that didn't look right. His name was Nicholas Bowen. saw him hugging Shanae's mother, and he said, "We're going to help. We're going to find your daughter and bring her home." When I talked to him, his body language, it didn't seem right. When you get in close to someone like this, they'll start to lean into you. And if you can just casually, physically touch them, they'll collapse on you if you got it right. I said, "I'm asking for your help because I think something bad happened." He laid his head in my chest and started to cry, and he's like, "She's hurt bad. She's bleeding bad." And I said, "I've seen a lot of people bleed bad and live. You gotta get me to her." We discovered Shanae buried in a shallow grave. When you see what's done with a child, it's just evil.
I heard that mother let out that scream, and I knew what it was. Once you hear it, you would understand it because it's the most soul-touching scream that a woman will ever let out.
Most people knew that he'd been arrested. There's a couple hundred people across the street, easy. He was 6'2", 200 some pounds. You know, a man by every other standard but his age. He was only 17 and a half. That would have put him at 12 at the time. Nicholas Bowen was too young to have been involved in Shauna Howell's murder.
When they said that they had found the guy and that he wouldn't have been old enough when Shauna was murdered, I was mad. I mean, I've been waiting 5 years and there's still nothing. You don't have any more information to give me in 97 than you did in 92. From the outside looking in, what have you done?
The leads slowed. Sometimes nobody would call anything in for weeks. After a while, it got to a point where I was pretty much on my own. Somewhere around that time, I retired, and it went cold.
He said, "It's basically a cold case. It's basically dead." I said, "Yeah, so's my daughter."
The investigation grinds to a halt and time moves on. But the Howell family still needs answers. No longer a patrolman, Rich Graham now works as a detective to close the Howell case.
You're trained not to become personally involved in any case, but how do you not, particularly a child who's murdered this way?
He came to the house one day and he introduced himself. He looked me right directly in the eyes and he says, "I'm gonna solve this." You know, there was no hesitation. After years waiting for somebody to do anything, it felt good.
I continue to carry a normal caseload.
He had, I believe, 72 cases. But every night, he was reading the Shauna Howell case.
I'm slow.
He's dyslexic.
When I read something, I read it several times to make sure it sinks in and I've got it right. Sometimes the second or third look, you'll see maybe a word or a phrase that you didn't pick up on the first time.
He looked at the autopsy photos and he looked at the coroner's report and he said, "This doesn't make sense."
One of the things was a mark we saw on her cheek. It appeared to be a partial shoe print. And there was not even any mention of that in the autopsy. Betsy and I went to see Helbert Fillinger, a renowned medical examiner. We reviewed photos of Shauna's corpse. Helbert agreed that that appeared to be a shoe print we saw on her cheek. He said this was a violent rape. Pretty sick. said somehow they held her in captivity for a couple of days, but there's no evidence of any restraints. That suggested to him that it was quite possible that more than one person was involved. For many years, I always believed that it probably was just one person. This was an moment.
This is not one person. This is most likely two and probably more.
There was only DNA from one suspect on Shauna's body. And that may be the basis for thinking there was only one person involved. But that's not necessarily true. Just because you don't have a DNA match does not mean that the person wasn't involved or had knowledge of the crime or assisted in some way.
We decide to do a big sweep again. We go back to all the local departments. One of the places we went was the fire department. 1992. The fire department got called to a fire in a red car. That car belonged to Ted Walker. Ted Walker's name had been brought up numerous times. He had met Shauna at a pizza place. Walker opened his house to young kids in the area. It was like a little bit of a flop house. And Ted fit the description perfect. If Walker's car was the Chevy Chevette the witness saw, and he fit the description, throw that together with a car being set on fire. Did Ted have her in the back seat? Did something take place back there? I think that was done to destroy evidence.
Mr. Walker, are you aware that this conversation is being recorded?
Yep.
And
No problems.
you do not have a problem that it's
Nope.
being recorded? Thank
Nothing to hide.
Mr. Walker was interviewed here by the state police on more than one occasion.
How is it did you first learn of Shauna Howe's abduction?
Tim and Jim O'Brien came and told me.
He hears about the case from Jim and Tim O'Brien, who come into his house. He could have made up any name. Nobody would have been able to question him on that.
They just came running in telling me that a little girl was kidnapped downtown.
Ted Walker says the O'Briens told him about Shauna's abduction. So I asked Chuck Daly, hey, Chuck, do you ever look at the O'Briens? And Chuck said, yeah, they were in jail. They couldn't have done it. That's when I realized I had never seen a report documenting that they had been in jail on the night of the abduction. So that's when I get a hold of Trooper John McClain, who was a friend of mine. I told him, I'd like for you to get out and check if the O'Briens were in jail when Shauna was abducted. And then he came back to me and said, Rick, they weren't there. They had bonded up. Now I'm believing that these guys are good for this. And we've spent all these years and all these resources, all the while believing that they were incarcerated. I'm high on the O'Briens. And I went down to interview Tim O'Brien at the county jail. Tim O'Brien was in jail for sexually assaulting a girl. And his brother, Jim O'Brien, had been arrested by the Oil City police for trying to abduct a woman, trying to stuff her into a trunk. It was really a brief conversation. I said, Tim, would you mind giving us a DNA sample for the Shauna Howe case? And he hesitated just for a couple of seconds, and just the way he responded, he said, well, I'll have to check with my attorney. And as I went to leave, I saw this candy wrapper chill went down my spine. Chill that starts up at your neck and runs down to your tailbone, and kind of a little shiver. I want to get the DNA because I think these O'Briens are good for this. After all these years, I think we may have finally found the killers. Early February is when I got the call from the crime lab. Jim O'Brien's a match.
When the DNA is discovered, Ted Walker's name comes in as the one who mentions the O'Briens. It just adds up. It is 3 people. Jim and Tim O'Brien and Ted Walker.
Ted Walker was arrested as an accessory to the homicide of Shauna Howe.
We're going to take this back to 1992. We know that a witness saw somebody walk up to Shauna Howe. Isn't that right?
Right.
And who was that person the witness saw?
Me.
Right. So you walk up to her, and as you're approaching her, you ask her what?
She was selling Girl Scout cookies.
Okay. And why do you ask her that?
Because I like ordering Girl Scout.
Right, I know that, but
Just to make her feel at ease.
make her feel at ease. Then what do you do?
Well, I grab a hold of her and take her
How
back.
did you grab her? How did-
around the shoulders.
You grab her,
Carry down, hand her to Tim.
you hand her to Tim.
So there's Walker handing her off to somebody, but then there's somebody driving the car. And they're all 3 involved in that.
You get back to your house. What's the next thing that happens?
They come in carrying Shauna. I'm going up the steps.
The O'Briens, those guys have a little girl that to them, that's a playground.
Once they got upstairs, I heard her screaming, struggling. Leave me go, get off me.
He actually, I think, one time he yells at them to keep her quiet, and they want to know then, how do we keep her quiet? And he says, well, you know, get her some candy.
We picked Halloween night. It was only supposed to be a prank.
And other than Walker, these guys have never talked. These guys have never admitted what they did. But what happened, I think, is they assaulted her upstairs. Then they left, and that's when they went out to Coulter's Hole. But this bodysuit, I think they took her and they assaulted her again out there. Now this child doesn't have clothes. So they kept her in that car overnight, in the trunk. She had these brush burns on her knees, and I think it was from the carpeting in the car.
We know we had an alpha male in Jimmy, and he was a true sociopath. We know we have Timmy, who was the follower. Then we have Ted Walker, who plays the dummy, but he's not the dummy at all. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Ted could have been the mastermind right behind Jimmy.
At some point, they decide that they've had their way with her, their pleasure or whatever. Perhaps the heat is on now because there are all these investigators in town, so they decide she can identify us, we got to get rid of her. They take her out and throw her off that trestle. I'm glad for Shauna, but the other thing is, I just feel sad. I feel sad that this happened to her, that she didn't get to grow up and live a normal life.
The detectives of Oil City delivered justice as the O'Briens and Ted Walker are imprisoned for the murder of Shauna Howe. And after 13 years, the Howe family finally has the truth and hopefully some kind of peace.
I think about her every day. I miss her every day. But I can say I love you, Shauna, and go on with my day. I'm not frozen in that time anymore. I love my daughter. I miss her with everything that's in me. But she's not in pain. What they did to her can't hurt her anymore. And I know I still love her till this day. And that's not going to go away, no matter what.
There is a specific, profound kind of silence that exists only in the most isolated corners of the world. A silence that is not the absence of sound, but rather the overwhelming presence of nature itself. In the remote, sun-drenched expanses of the South Pacific lies the unincorporated territory of American Samoa. It is a place characterized by its breathtaking, jagged volcanic peaks, its impenetrable and ancient rainforests, and a deep, enduring sense of community where the isolation for the larger world binds people together in a tight, inescapable web of familiarity. In a community like this, bordered on all sides by the vast and unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean, everyone knows everyone. The faces you see at the local market are the same faces you grew up with, the same people you see at community gatherings, the same individuals whose histories and lineages are intertwined with your own. It is a paradise painted in broad strokes of emerald green and sapphire blue, a place that outwardly projects tranquility, tradition, and an unhurried way of life. But human nature is not bound by geography, and the darkness that can take root in the human mind does not respect the boundaries of paradise. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not strangers lurking in the shadows of a sprawling, anonymous metropolis, but the people we recognize, the people who walk among us, the people who allow grievances to fester in the quiet, unseen corners of their own minds until those grievances mutate into something unspeakably violent. The year 2003 would forever alter the historical and psychological landscape of American Samoa. It was the year that the territory would bear witness to an act of violence so profoundly cold-blooded, so exceptionally barbaric, that would fracture the community's collective sense of safety and leave an indelible, dark stain on the judicial history of the island. This is not a story of a random act of violence, nor is it a tale of a momentary lapse of reason or a crime of sudden, uncontrollable passion. This is the meticulously documented account of the tragic murder of Wyatt Bowles Jr., a man whose life was extinguished in the most gruesome manner imaginable, and the terrifyingly calculated actions of his killer, a 34-year-old man named Richard Modger. It is a narrative that forces us to confront the darkest extremes of human capability, exploring what happens when the mundane reality of interpersonal conflict is allowed to sour, to curdle, and ultimately, to transform into a meticulous blueprint for murder and desecration. To understand the sheer magnitude of the crime that unfolded in 2003, one must first understand the devastating power of unresolved personal conflict. We all experience disagreements, slights, and animosities in our daily lives. For the vast majority of human beings, these conflicts are eventually resolved, forgotten, or simply compartmentalized, buried beneath the routine of everyday existence. But for a specific type of psychological profile, a grievance is not something to be let go of. It is something to be nurtured. It becomes a parasite of the mind, feeding on perceived wrongs, growing larger and more demanding with each passing day. The records of the American Samoa government versus Richard Modger indicate that the animosity between Modger and Wyatt Bowles Jr. was not a sudden explosion, but an accumulation. It was a slow drip of toxic resentment that built up over time, an interpersonal conflict that proved impossible to resolve through conversation, mediation, or simply walking away. For Richard Modger, this accumulation of hostility reached a critical mass, fundamentally altering his perception of reality and humanity. Wyatt Bowles Jr. was no longer a neighbor, an acquaintance, or a fellow human being. In the twisted, narrowing tunnel of Modger's mind, Wyatt became a target that needed to be fundamentally and entirely eradicated. The true horror of this case lies in the chilling premeditation that followed. Richard Modger did not snap in a moment of heated argument. Instead, he engaged in a terrifying display of predatory patience. He formulated a plan that required emotional detachment, deceptive charm, and a profound lack of empathy. Modger actively sought out Wyatt Bowles Jr., closing the distance between them not with a weapon drawn, but with the disarming guise of normalcy. He weaponized trust, or at least the basic human assumption of safety, to manipulate his victim. The strategy was as simple as it was devastating: to lure Wyatt away from the safety of the community, away from the watchful eyes of neighbors, friends, and family, and draw him into the isolated, rugged terrain of the island. American Samoa's geography is as beautiful as it is treacherous. Beyond the coastal settlements, the land rises sharply into steep, densely forested mountains. The vegetation is thick, forming a natural labyrinth of vines, underbrush, and towering trees that can disorient even the most experienced local. It is a landscape that can swallow a person whole, a place where a scream can be easily absorbed by the dense canopy and the endless sound of the wind moving through the leaves. It was into this unforgiving environment that Richard Modger, guided Wyatt Bowles Jr. Modger, had deliberately chosen a desolate, sparsely populated area, an environment that would act as a silent, unseeing accomplice to the atrocity he was about to commit. By isolating his victim, Modger ensured that there would be no witnesses, no chance for intervention, and no hope for rescue. In that remote, silent stretch of the island, far removed from the protective structures of civilization, Richard Modger executed his plan. He cold-bloodedly stripped Wyatt Bowles Jr. of his life, a brutal culmination of the hatred that had been festering within him. However, the act of murder was only the beginning of the nightmare. If the taking of a life demonstrates a profound disregard for human existence, what followed demonstrated an absolute, chilling descent into depravity. Richard Modger was acutely aware of the consequences of his actions. He knew that the sudden disappearance of a community member would trigger an immediate and intensive investigation by the local authorities. He needed to ensure that Wyatt Bowles Jr. did not just die, but that he vanished completely, leaving no trace, no narrative, and no evidence that could link the disappearance back to the 34-year-old killer. To achieve this, Modger crossed a psychological threshold that very few human beings can even comprehend. He subjected the remains of Wyatt Bowles Jr. to an act of post-mortem violence that remains one of the most savage elements of this case. In a desperate, grotesque bid to obscure the identity of the victim, destroy potential forensic evidence, and facilitate the physical transportation of the remains, Modger systematically dismembered the body. The psychological toll required to dismember a human being is staggering. It requires a complete and utter dehumanization of the victim. It transforms a person into a mere object, a problem to be physically dismantled and disposed of. It is an act of manual labor steeped in horror, a prolonged, intimate interaction with death that requires the perpetrator to silence every instinct of human decency and revulsion. After completing this horrifying task, Modger took the fragmented remains of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and scattered them deep within the island's most inaccessible thickets. He plunged into the dense, thorny bushes of the remote terrain, utilizing the harsh landscape as a natural vault. His intention was clear: to let the relentless forces of the tropical environment, the heat, the humidity, the scavenging wildlife, and the encroaching vegetation, erase the final physical proof of Wyatt's existence and, by extension, the proof of Modger's monstrous crime. He believed that the unforgiving nature of the island would protect him, that the deep wilderness would hold its secrets forever. For a time, the brutal landscape did exactly what Modger had hoped it would do. The subsequent investigation, launched by the American Samoa Police Force, was met with monumental, seemingly insurmountable challenges. Searching for a missing person in dense, mountainous jungle is a logistical nightmare. Every step is an arduous battle against the terrain. The heat is oppressive, the sightlines are restricted to a few feet, and the sheer vastness of the wilderness can make the search feel entirely futile. The police were not just fighting a cunning killer who had painstakingly covered his tracks. They were fighting the island itself. The intricate, ruthless methodology of the perpetrator, combined with the hostile geographical realities of the search zones, created a scenario where the truth seemed permanently buried. Yet, the arrogance of the killer fundamentally underestimated the tenacity of the investigators and the uncompromising, objective reality of modern forensic science. The human body, even when subjected to the most extreme forms of violence and desecration, has a profound tendency to tell its own story. The landscape, no matter how wild and untamed, cannot easily wash away the microscopic, biological signatures of crime. Through an exhaustive, painstaking process of methodical searching, battling the elements and the unforgiving terrain day after day, the authorities began to slowly uncover the scattered, hidden fragments of the truth. The discovery of the remains was a moment of profound darkness for the community, a confirmation of their worst fears, but it was also the turning point in the pursuit of justice. The breakthrough did not come from a sudden confession or a dramatic eyewitness account, but from the silent, irrefutable testimony of biology. In his desperate attempt to erase Wyatt Bowles Jr., Richard Modger had failed to realize that the act of violent destruction inherently leaves traces of the destroyer. The crime scene, though dispersed and hidden deep within the island's foliage, yielded critical biological evidence. DNA analysis, alongside trace evidence recovered from the remains and the various disposal sites, began to weave a molecular net around the killer. It was these microscopic fragments, the invisible biological markers left behind in the chaotic brutality of the murder and the dismemberment, that ultimately formed the strongest links in the chain of evidence. They provided an unassailable narrative that cut through Modger's deceptions, directly connecting the 34-year-old man to the horrific fate of his victim. This relentless pursuit of the truth, driven by scientific certainty and unwavering investigative resolve, would eventually culminate in a historic legal reckoning. It would take 3 agonizing years of meticulous evidence gathering, forensic analysis, and legal preparation before the case was finally ready for the courtroom. In 2006, the High Court of American Samoa convened to address an atrocity that had permanently scarred the territory. The trial was not merely a procedural formality. It was a societal confrontation with absolute evil. The details that emerged during the proceedings painted a portrait of a crime so uniquely severe, so characterized by base cruelty and savage methodology, that it demanded an unprecedented response from the justice system. The resulting verdict, a sentence of 50 years in prison with absolutely no possibility of parole or early release, was a monumental declaration by the court. It was a definitive, unyielding statement that a crime of this magnitude, an act so corrosive to the very fabric of human society, necessitated the permanent exile of the perpetrator from the free world. It was an absolute mandate to ensure that Richard Modger would never again walk the lush, isolated paths of the island he had desecrated, forever sequestering the monster away from the paradise he had stained with such unimaginable violence. To truly grasp the devastating impact of the tragedy surrounding Wyatt Bowles Jr., one must first transport oneself to the specific, intensely isolated reality of American Samoa in the year 2003. It is a territory suspended in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the South Pacific Ocean, a chain of volcanic islands where the mountains rise dramatically from the ocean floor, draped in a dense, almost impenetrable canopy of vibrant green rainforest. The physical isolation of this place is absolute, separated from the nearest major landmasses by thousands of miles of deep, rolling water. This geographical seclusion breeds a unique societal structure, one that is entirely dependent on interconnectedness, tradition, and mutual reliance. In a community that is physically bound by the endless ocean, the concept of true urban anonymity simply does not exist. The people who inhabit these islands do not live in isolation from one another. They live in a deeply woven tapestry of shared histories, overlapping familial ties, and daily, unavoidable social interactions. It is an environment where the boundaries between neighbors are remarkably porous, where everyone knows the rhythm and flow of their community, and where the sudden absence of a single individual resonates like a missing, vital note in a deeply familiar song. This was the world that Wyatt Bowles Jr. inhabited, a world that offered the profound, enveloping comfort of belonging, but alongside it, the inescapable reality of continuous social visibility. In such a closely knit society, there's a pervasive, almost unconscious assumption of fundamental physical and emotional safety. The shared, unspoken understanding among the residents is that while human disagreements will inevitably occur, the overarching historical bonds of the community will ultimately prevent any true, catastrophic harm from taking root. The random, senseless violence that plagues the anonymous streets of distant, sprawling cities feels like an abstract, alien concept, a phantom that cannot possibly cross the vast expanse of the ocean to infiltrate their tranquil, sun-drenched shores. The year 2003, however, would brutally and irrevocably shatter this collective, comforting illusion. It would reveal the terrifying, universal truth that the most profound dangers do not always arrive from the unknown outside world, but can instead gestate silently within the very heart of the community itself. When the predator is a familiar face, a person who walks the exact same streets, shops at the same local markets, and breathes the same humid, salt-tinged air, the traditional human mechanisms of self-defense and suspicion are entirely neutralized. The tight-knit community of American Samoa was completely unprepared for the profound darkness that was quietly gathering force within the mind of 34-year-old Richard Modger, a darkness that would soon project itself outward with catastrophic, irreversible consequences for Wyatt Bowles Jr. Wyatt Bowles Jr. was a man whose entire existence was anchored in this specific geographic and cultural reality. He was not merely a name printed on a sterile police report or a tragic, two-dimensional figure destined to be remembered only by the horrific, bloody manner of his death. He was a living, breathing human being with a complex trajectory of his own, a life constructed of daily routines, personal aspirations, quiet struggles, and a network of relationships that defined his place in the world. When a human life is suddenly extinguished with such overwhelming, calculated brutality, it is a tragically common phenomenon for the identity of the victim to be entirely eclipsed by the monstrous nature of the crime itself. The historical narrative easily becomes dominated by the actions, the psychology, and the trial of the perpetrator, while the humanity of the victim is slowly reduced to a passive, tragic canvas upon which the violence was mercilessly enacted. To understand the true gravity and the agonizing sorrow of this case, one must actively and forcefully resist that erasure. One must remember that before he was a victim, Wyatt Bowles Jr. was simply a man navigating the everyday complexities of his life, entirely unaware that the normal orbit of his existence was tragically intersecting with a profound and calculated malice. His life held intrinsic, immeasurable value, a value that was completely and utterly disregarded in the cold, transactional calculus of his murderer. The ultimate vulnerability of Wyatt Bowles Jr. was not born of physical weakness or a foolish lack of situational awareness, but rather from the fundamental, everyday social trust that allows human societies to function without collapsing into paranoia. We all operate under the basic assumption that the people we interact with, even those with whom we experience severe friction and animosity, are fundamentally bound by the same basic moral parameters that govern our own behavior. We naturally assume that a dispute, no matter how bitter, petty, or prolonged it may be, will ultimately remain within the realm of angry words, perhaps escalating to strained silences or deliberate social avoidance, but never crossing the ultimate, forbidden threshold into fatal physical violence. Wyatt Bowles Jr. operated under this exact same universal human assumption. He navigated his social environment, including his fraught and difficult dynamic with Richard Modger, with the logical expectation that the conflict was ultimately survivable and bounded by the laws of civilized society. He could not possibly have known that he was dealing with an individual who was systematically dismantling those very moral parameters within the dark confines of his own mind, preparing to execute an act of ultimate, irreversible transgression. This fundamental asymmetry in perception, pitting Wyatt's adherence to normal human interaction against Modger's secret, complete abandonment of those norms, created a fatal, catastrophic blind spot that the killer would mercilessly exploit. The relationship between Wyatt Bowles Jr. and Richard Modger was deeply defined by an accumulation of personal conflict, a toxic, invisible undercurrent that had slowly poisoned their interactions over a significant period of time. The nature of interpersonal conflict in an isolated, island-based community is inherently and dangerously different from conflict in a transient, expansive continental environment. On a small island, you cannot simply pack your belongings, walk away, and disappear into an anonymous crowd. You cannot easily sever social ties and guarantee that you will never cross paths with your adversary again. The physical boundaries of the land mass force constant, unavoidable proximity, forcing individuals to repeatedly confront the living sources of their frustration and anger. Every chance encounter at a store, every shared public social space, becomes a tense, potential flashpoint for renewed hostility. The conflict between Bowles and Modger did not naturally dissipate with time. Instead, it stagnated, deepened, and fermented. It became a trapped, volatile energy, swirling endlessly within the claustrophobic confines of their shared geography. For Wyatt Bowles Jr., this ongoing, unresolved tension was likely a source of significant daily stress, a highly uncomfortable reality of island life that simply had to be managed, ignored, and endured as best as possible. But for Richard Modger, the conflict was definitively not something to be managed or endured. It was an intolerable situation that had to be entirely, permanently eradicated. In the complex, terrifying psychology of a carefully planned murder, the original, factual cause of the animosity often becomes entirely secondary to the all-consuming obsession it ultimately spawns. What might have logically begun as a mundane disagreement, a perceived personal slight, or a simple, unfortunate clash of incompatible personalities, gradually mutated into something unrecognizable within the mind of Richard Modger. It completely ceased to be a standard interpersonal issue and transformed into a deeply internalized, inescapable narrative of necessary destruction. The 34-year-old Modger voluntarily allowed the grievance to consume his entire cognitive landscape. He actively nurtured his anger, shielding and protecting it from the mitigating, humanizing influences of reason, time, or empathy. In this dark, internal echo chamber of his own creation, the fundamental humanity of Wyatt Bowles Jr. was systematically and ruthlessly stripped away. Modger completely stopped seeing Wyatt as a flawed but equal human being possessing his own valid perspective and right to exist, and instead began to view him entirely as an inanimate obstacle, a persistent source of irritation that required extreme, permanent, and violent removal. This slow, deliberate process of psychological dehumanization is the absolute, terrifying prerequisite for cold-blooded murder. It is the exact psychological mechanism by which a seemingly ordinary, functioning individual silently convinces themselves that taking another human life is not only acceptable, but absolutely morally necessary. The transition from internally possessing a murderous desire to physically executing a meticulously structured murderous plan requires a chilling, almost incomprehensible degree of cognitive dissonance. It requires the perpetrator to flawlessly maintain the outward appearance of a normal, functioning, rational member of society while simultaneously engineering a catastrophic, barbaric act of extreme violence in the shadows. Richard Modger demonstrated a terrifying, flawless mastery of this dangerous duality. As the unspoken tension between him and Wyatt Bowles Jr. reached its silent, invisible zenith in the year 2003, Modger did not exhibit the erratic, impulsive, noticeable behavior of a man losing control of his emotions. Instead, he exhibited the highly focused, terrifyingly patient calm of an apex predator meticulously studying its prey. He clearly understood the daily rhythms of Wyatt's life. He intimately understood the rugged, unforgiving geography of the island, and he fully understood the immense, paralyzing logistical challenges of committing a murder and disposing of a body in a place where everyone is constantly watching everyone else. Modger knew with absolute certainty that an open, public confrontation would be disastrous to his own freedom, and that any visible display of violence would immediately result in his rapid apprehension by local authorities. Therefore, the execution of his deep-seated malice had to be entirely cloaked in absolute, flawless deception. He had to violently suppress his profound, boiling hatred beneath a manufactured veneer of casual approachability, utilizing the very familiarity of their shared community as the fatal bait for his trap. In the days and hours leading up to the final, fatal encounter, the atmosphere surrounding Wyatt Bowles Jr. would have been completely, tragically devoid of any overt cinematic warnings. There was no ominous, sudden shift in the tropical weather to signal the rapidly approaching tragedy. The sun continued to rise reliably over the vast Pacific Ocean, casting long, familiar, comforting shadows across the steep volcanic slopes and the dense greenery. The mundane, daily routines of the island continued entirely unabated, presenting a facade of perfect normalcy. This is the profound, deeply unsettling terror of premeditated violence. It seamlessly and perfectly camouflages itself within the absolute, boring ordinary. Wyatt Bowles Jr. lived his final, precious days completely and utterly unaware of the invisible, lethal, and unstoppable machinery that had been deliberately set into motion against him by a man he knew. He woke up each morning, moved freely through his environment, and engaged with his community, completely oblivious to the horrifying fact that his personal timeline was rapidly, inevitably converging with a moment of unspeakable, violent horror. He existed in a fragile state of innocent ignorance, shielded entirely by his ingrained belief in the basic, fundamental safety of his world, while Richard Modger coldly, methodically finalized the gruesome logistical details of a living nightmare waiting just out of sight. The ultimate horrific success of Richard Modger's plan hinged entirely on a catastrophic, calculated manipulation of basic human trust, or at the very least, a devious manipulation of Wyatt Bowles Jr.'s basic, ingrained expectation of physical safety during daylight hours. Modger had to carefully engineer a highly specific scenario where Wyatt would willingly and voluntarily accompany him, leaving behind the protective, watchful gaze of the community and stepping blindly into an isolated zone of absolute, inescapable vulnerability. The chilling records dictate that Modger actively and purposely approached his victim, initiating a deceptive interaction that required Wyatt to momentarily suspend whatever reservations or fears he might have harbored due to their long, accumulated history of conflict. The exact words that were exchanged between the two men, the precise, cunning nature of the deception utilized by Modger to persuade Wyatt to isolate himself, remain permanently locked away in the terrible, silent history of that fateful day. What is irrefutably, tragically known is that the cold deception was entirely and flawlessly successful. Wyatt Bowles Jr., operating under the tragic, fundamental delusion that he was merely engaging in a perhaps uncomfortable but ultimately safe human interaction, willingly allowed himself to be guided away from the sanctuary of the known world. He unknowingly stepped entirely off the invisible map of community safety and followed his murder directly into the desolate, unseeing, and unforgiving wilderness, moving step by step toward the utter, brutal annihilation that silently awaited him in the deep, verdant shadows of the island. The path into the deep, interior wilderness of American Samoa is not a journey taken by the faint of heart, nor is it a route traveled by those seeking the comforts of modern civilization. It is a transition from the structured, familiar reality of the coastal villages into a world defined by the untamed and the ancient. As Richard Modger led Wyatt Bowles Jr. away from the familiar sights, the intermittent sounds of human activity, and the watchful periphery of their community, the terrain shifted beneath their feet. The ground became uneven, slick with the omnipresent moisture of the tropics, and increasingly steep as they ascended toward the island's mountainous spine. This was the landscape Modger had chosen for his final, gruesome objective, a place where the density of the foliage and the ruggedness of the volcanic rock would act as his silent, unblinking witness. For Wyatt, the walk might have initially seemed like an opportunity to finally confront and resolve the lingering, festering tensions that had cast a long shadow over their relationship. He was moving toward a resolution that he believed was possible, a reconciliation that he hoped would restore a semblance of peace to his daily life. He possessed no way of knowing that he was not walking toward a conversation, but rather toward the absolute, final termination of his own existence at the hands of the man who had long ago abandoned any capacity for compromise or mercy. The atmosphere in that isolated, verdant expanse was thick with the humidity that defines the Pacific tropics, a heavy, stifling air that seems to press against the skin and muffle the senses. As they moved deeper into the desolate, sparsely populated sector Modger had selected, the natural silence of the jungle became more pronounced, punctuated only by the occasional cry of a bird or the distant, rhythmic rustle of the wind through the massive, waxy leaves of the canopy. There was a profound, almost oppressive sense of stillness that enveloped them, a solitude that in any other context might be perceived as peaceful or meditative, but in this specific, lethal trajectory served only to underscore the total lack of witnesses. Modger walked with the steady, focused pace of a man who had already completed the act in his mind 1,000 times over. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate, his internal state entirely detached from the humanity of the man walking beside him. He had already achieved the necessary, chilling psychological separation. For him, Wyatt had already ceased to be a neighbor and had instead become the logistical problem he was now in the process of solving. The sheer, terrifying weight of his premeditated intent allowed him to maintain a facade of calm, a mask of normalcy that prevented Wyatt from perceiving the fatal, imminent danger that was closing in around him like a tightening noose. The transition from a state of life to the absolute finality of death in such a location is a moment of profound, singular violence. When the confrontation finally shifted from the pretense of conversation to the reality of the assault, the isolation Modger had sought worked with devastating, clockwork efficiency. There was no one to hear a struggle, no one to intervene, no one to call out for help that could possibly arrive in time. In that remote, desolate pocket of the island, separated from all human oversight, Modger finally unleashed the totality of the malice that had been accumulating for years. The physical act of murder was not a chaotic, desperate explosion of passion, but the cold, clinical execution of a long-held, secret plan. He had stripped Wyatt of his agency, his voice, and ultimately his life, with an efficiency that speaks to the depth of his detachment and the severity of his depravity. The life of Wyatt Bowles Jr., a life defined by his own personal hopes, struggles, and connections to the community, was extinguished in the dark, unseeing shadows of the volcanic forest, leaving behind nothing but the cold, physical fact of a body lying on the damp, earthen floor of the jungle. If the murder itself represented a total collapse of humanity, the actions that followed were in descent into a realm of horror that defies easy articulation. Richard Modger did not simply commit a murder and flee. He remained anchored to the scene by the terrifying logistical necessity of total concealment. He understood that in a place where everyone is a neighbor, the discovery of a body would lead to an investigation that would leave no stone unturned, no theory unexamined. To ensure his own survival and to maintain his tenuous grip on his place in the world, he had to erase the victim entirely. This required a level of psychological fortitude, or rather a total absence of moral sensitivity, that is chilling to consider. The act of dismembering a human body is an experience of such profound, intimate brutality that it forces the perpetrator to confront the reality of death in its most grotesque physical form. Yet, Modger proceeded with the systematic, cold-blooded efficiency of someone performing a dark, repetitive task, his actions driven by a desperate, selfish need to outpace the inevitable reach of the law. He reduced a man he had known, a man with a life and a history, to a series of physical components, treating the remains with a mechanical, horrifying detachment that signals a total, irreparable rupture from the norms of human behavior. As he worked, the environment itself seemed to take on a dual role, simultaneously hiding the atrocity while forcing him to contend with the visceral reality of his crime. The heat of the tropical day, the swarming insects, and the encroaching, aggressive growth of the rainforest formed the backdrop for his dark labor. He labored in the silence, moving the fragmented remains away from the primary site of the murder, scattering them deep into the thickets and the dense, thorny underbrush that characterizes the island's more inaccessible zones. His intent was to use the very geography of American Samoa as a shroud, to entrust his secret to the soil, the roots, and the slow, inexorable processes of decay. He relied on the hope that the sheer density of the vegetation would prevent discovery, that the harsh, unforgiving nature of the interior would shield him from the consequences of his transgression. He was playing a dangerous, high-stakes game of concealment, convinced that his knowledge of the landscape and his ability to manipulate the evidence would be sufficient to keep the truth buried forever. He did not account for the fact that every act of human violence leaves a mark upon the world, a lingering, undeniable trace that, while invisible to the casual eye, remains available to those who know how to look for it. The hours during which Modger carried out this final, wretched stage of his plan were likely filled with an intense, singular focus, an adrenaline-fueled dedication to his own preservation. He was effectively betting his future, his freedom, and his very life on the assumption that the island would hold his secret, that the dense green canopy would remain a silent guardian of his crime. He moved through the terrain he knew so well, selecting, hiding, and abandoning the remains of Wyatt Bowles Jr. in the most remote, difficult-to-navigate thickets he could find. With each fragment he placed, he was attempting to physically deconstruct the evidence of his own existence as a murderer, trying to erase the narrative of the crime before it could even be written by the investigators. He believed he was in control, that he was the architect of a perfect, untraceable disappearance. He was profoundly wrong. The irony of the situation lies in the fact that while he sought to use the wilderness as his accomplice, the very complexity of that same wilderness would eventually become the stage for his undoing. His actions were not just crimes against a fellow human being. They were a violation of the entire community, a brutal act of defiance against the shared moral fabric that held the people of American Samoa together. As the sun began to set over the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the island, Modger exited the deep woods, returning to the world of the living, the world of the mundane, the world of the neighbors and the routines he had just so brutally manipulated. He carried with him the weight of what he had done, hidden beneath an impenetrable, sociopathic facade. To any casual observer, he was simply Richard Modger, 34 years of age, moving through his day like any other resident of the territory. They did not see the darkness he had just deposited in the mountains, the physical remnants of a life he had just extinguished, or the deep, permanent stain of blood that now marked his own conscience, if such a thing still existed within him. He was a man who had successfully navigated the most difficult, most horrific, and most testing gauntlet of his life, and he was now ready to resume his existence, banking on the silence of the forest to protect him from the inevitable day of reckoning. He could not, however, have known that the very evidence he had tried to scatter would eventually speak for itself, that the biology of his crime would be the key that would unlock the truth of his actions, and that his carefully crafted silence would, in time, be broken by the cold, irrefutable language of forensic science. His path forward was now one of waiting, a silent, nerve-wracking countdown to the moment when the world would finally discover the truth about what had truly transpired in the deep, silent woods of American Samoa. The disappearance of a human being within a geographically confined and highly interconnected society like American Samoa does not occur in a vacuum. It triggers an immediate, palpable disturbance in the social equilibrium. When Wyatt Bowles Jr. failed to return to his normal routines, the absence was not a quiet, easily overlooked anomaly, but a blaring alarm that resonated through the close-knit neighborhoods. The initial stages of the investigation were inevitably clouded by the standard, hopeful assumptions that accompany any missing person report. Authorities and community members alike naturally gravitated toward the belief that Wyatt had perhaps suffered a sudden medical emergency while hiking, or had decided to temporarily isolate himself, or had become disoriented in the dense, tropical foliage that fringes the edges of their civilization. The local police force, intimately familiar with the residents they served and the rugged landscape they patrolled, initiated a standard search protocol. They retraced his known steps, questioned those who had seen him last, and began to slowly comb the immediate periphery of the inhabited zones. However, as the hours stretched agonizingly into days, the heavy, suffocating weight of dread began to settle over the island. The hopeful theories rapidly evaporated in the sweltering Pacific heat, replaced by a chilling, unspoken consensus that something fundamentally unnatural and malicious had occurred. The investigation fundamentally shifted its posture, transforming from a desperate rescue mission into a grim, highly coordinated search for a victim of a terrible crime. The police were no longer just looking for a lost man. They were hunting for a ghost in a landscape perfectly designed to swallow a human being whole. The physical search for Wyatt Bowles Jr. presented the American Samoa police force with a logistical nightmare of staggering proportions. The interior of the island is a chaotic, vertical world of sheer volcanic rock, plunging ravines, and ancient rainforests so dense that they block out the sun even at midday. The search teams were forced to hack their way through impenetrable walls of vines and thorny underbrush, battling the oppressive humidity, the swarms of insects, and the constant, treacherous threat of hidden drop-offs. Every single step required monumental physical effort and unwavering mental concentration. The investigators and local volunteers moved shoulder to shoulder through the suffocating greenery, forming lines that were constantly broken and distorted by the unforgiving terrain. They probed the deep, silent shadows of the mountains, their calls for Wyatt absorbed and silenced by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The sheer scale of the environment made the endeavor feel hopelessly small, an exercise in futility against a landscape that had harbored secrets for millennia. The investigators were forced to confront the horrifying reality that a killer with intimate knowledge of this treacherous geography could easily deposit a body in a location so remote, so perfectly concealed that it might never be recovered. The physical exhaustion of the search was compounded by a growing psychological toll, a creeping despair that the island itself was actively conspiring with the murderer to hide the truth. Yet, driven by a profound sense of duty to Wyatt and an unyielding commitment to justice, the search teams refused to surrender to the impossible odds, pushing deeper into the most hostile, uninhabited sectors of the territory. The agonizing, prolonged period of uncertainty was ultimately shattered by a discovery so gruesome that it permanently altered the psychological landscape of the entire territory. Deep within a particularly dense, isolated thicket, far removed from any marked trail or signs of human activity, The relentless, methodical efforts of the search teams finally yielded a result. It was not the discovery of a lost hiker, but the horrifying unearthing of a meticulously concealed crime scene. The authorities found the first fragmented remains of Wyatt Bowles Jr., deliberately scattered and buried within the aggressive vegetation. The sheer brutality of the scene was a catastrophic shock to the system, instantly elevating the missing person case into a high-stakes, maximum priority homicide investigation. The realization that the victim had not only been murdered but intentionally dismembered sent a wave of profound revulsion and terror through the community. The investigators standing in that remote, sweltering patch of jungle understood immediately that they were not dealing with an accidental death or a crime of sudden, panicked passion. The condition and the strategic distribution of the remains painted a vivid, chilling portrait of a killer who possessed a terrifying degree of cold-blooded calculation, a perpetrator who had spent hours laboring in the dark to dismantle a human life and erase its physical form from the earth. The grim discovery site was immediately cordoned off, transforming the wild, untamed forest floor into a sterile, tightly controlled laboratory where the slow, painstaking process of forensic extraction would begin. This horrifying discovery marked the most critical turning point in the entire investigation, shifting the momentum away from the raw physical labor of the search and firmly into the microscopic, objective realm of forensic science. The killer, in his arrogant attempt to orchestrate the perfect disappearance, had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of violent crime. Richard Modger had believed that the dismemberment and the dispersal of the body parts in the remote wilderness would obliterate his identity as the perpetrator. He had placed his faith in the destructive power of the tropical environment, assuming the heat, the moisture, and the wildlife would quickly consume whatever evidence he had left behind. However, the very act of inflicting such profound trauma upon a human body is an inherently chaotic and messy process, one that inevitably transfers a microscopic universe of data between the victim, the perpetrator, and the environment. The crime scene investigators, clad in protective gear and working with agonizing precision beneath the dense jungle canopy, began to harvest this invisible evidence. They meticulously documented the precise location of every fragment, sifted through the damp soil, and collected the surrounding foliage, treating every single leaf and stone as a potential reservoir of truth. They were no longer searching for Wyatt Bowles Jr. They were searching for the biological signature of the monster who had taken him. The breakthrough that would ultimately seal Richard Modger's fate did not come from an eyewitness or a sudden confession, but from the silent, irrefutable testimony of biology. In the chaos of the murder and the subsequent horrors of the dismemberment, Modger had made the fatal, unavoidable mistakes that plague even the most meticulous killers. The forensic laboratories, operating far removed from the emotional turmoil of the island, began to process the physical evidence retrieved from the remote thickets. Through the advanced application of DNA analysis, scientists were able to isolate microscopic traces of biological material that did not belong to the victim. These microscopic markers, invisible to the naked eye but blaring like a siren under the lens of a microscope, provided a direct, indisputable link between the horrific crime scene and the outside world. The investigators began to meticulously cross-reference this biological profile against the individuals known to have had contact or conflict with Wyatt Bowles Jr. As the scientific data was painstakingly aligned with the timeline of Wyatt's disappearance and the known animosities within the community, the focus of the investigation rapidly narrowed, locking onto the 34-year-old Richard Modger like a guided missile. The biological evidence shattered Modger's carefully constructed facade of innocence, revealing the brutal truth hidden beneath his calm, unassuming exterior. Building a prosecution based on complex forensic evidence requires an extraordinary level of patience and unwavering attention to detail, a process that explains the grueling 3-year gap between the murder in 2003 and the final trial in 2006. The American Samoa Police Force and the prosecuting attorneys knew that they had only one opportunity to bring Modger to justice, and they could not afford a single procedural error or scientific ambiguity. They embarked on a massive, exhaustive effort to corroborate the DNA findings with every other available piece of circumstantial evidence. They reconstructed Modger's movements, scrutinized his alibis, and conducted hundreds of interviews, slowly tightening the investigative net around him. Every statement he had made, every action he had taken in the days surrounding the disappearance, was retroactively examined under the harsh, unforgiving light of the forensic reality. The investigators mapped out the precise nature of the historical conflict between Modger and Wyatt, establishing a clear, compelling motive that perfectly contextualized the extreme violence of the crime. The biological evidence served as the unbreakable anchor for the case, but the investigators worked tirelessly to build a comprehensive, airtight narrative around that anchor. They prepared to present a story that would logically and scientifically eliminate any possibility of secondary suspect, ensuring that when they finally stepped into the courtroom, the evidence against Richard Modger would be an overwhelming, undeniable avalanche of truth. The sheer scale of this investigative effort stands as a testament to the dedication of the authorities and the undeniable power of modern forensic science to penetrate the deepest, darkest secrets of human behavior. Richard Modger had designed a crime that he believed was unsolvable, leveraging the isolation of the island and the brutal methodology of dismemberment to guarantee his freedom. He had underestimated the tenacity of the human spirit to seek justice and the uncompromising nature of biological reality. The DNA left at the scene, the microscopic traces of his own existence mixed with the horror he had created, became the ultimate instrument of his downfall. The 3 years of meticulous, exhausting investigative work systematically dismantled every layer of his deception, transforming his arrogant belief in a perfect crime into a meticulously documented roadmap for his own prosecution. By the time the authorities finalized their case, the invisible biological markers had been translated into a loud, clear, and legally binding accusation, setting the stage for a judicial confrontation that would finally force Richard Modger to answer for the unspeakable atrocities he had committed in the silent, remote shadows of the American Samoa wilderness. As the final pieces of the investigative puzzle snapped perfectly into place, a profound sense of grim resolution settled over the law enforcement agencies involved. They had successfully navigated one of the most complex, psychologically draining, and logistically challenging investigations in the history of the territory. The transition from the initial desperate search for a missing man to the methodical, scientifically driven pursuit of a cold-blooded killer was complete. The evidence was secured, the biological reports were finalized, and the comprehensive timeline of the murder and the subsequent cover-up was solidified. The authorities were no longer chasing a ghost. They had firmly captured a monster in a cage built of undeniable, irrefutable scientific fact. The focus now shifted entirely from the rugged, untamed wilderness of the island to the structured, solemn halls of the justice system. The immense burden of proof had been met. The silence of the remote thickets had been scientifically broken, and the stage was finally, irreversibly set for the High Court of American Samoa to deliver the ultimate reckoning for the life of Wyatt Bowles Jr. The meticulous 3-year investigation had ensured that the truth, no matter how deeply buried or savagely obscured, had finally been brought out into the blinding, inescapable light of day. The trial of Richard Modger, which finally convened in the High Court of American Samoa in 2006, was not merely a judicial proceeding. It was a profound and necessary confrontation between the civilized moral order of the community and the darkest, most aberrant expression of human cruelty. 3 years of intensive, methodical investigation had culminated in a body of evidence so comprehensive and so scientifically robust that it seemed to render the final courtroom battle an inevitability rather than a contest. Yet, the gravity of the crimes committed, the cold-blooded murder of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and the subsequent, systematic, and nauseating desecration of his remains, demanded a formal, solemn, and exhaustive accounting. The atmosphere within the courtroom was heavy, permeated by a palpable, collective sorrow and an unwavering, quiet resolve to secure justice for a life so senselessly and brutally extinguished. As the presiding judges, the defense, and the prosecution assembled, the weight of the tragedy was inescapable, acting as a silent, invisible participant in every word spoken, every document presented, and every witness testimony given. The trial served as the final, critical stage of a long, arduous process to restore a sense of balance to a society that had been profoundly shaken to its core by the realization that such profound evil had gestated in its own midst. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of logical, scientific, and chronological precision, carefully constructed to dismantle any remaining remnants of Richard Modger's facade. They did not rely on inflammatory rhetoric or emotional exploitation to make their point. Instead, they anchored their presentation in the cold, unassailable reality of the forensic evidence. The introduction of the biological findings was the undisputed center of the courtroom drama, a moment where the invisible threads of DNA, meticulously harvested from the remote, mountainous crime scenes, were woven together to form an irrefutable tapestry of guilt. The expert testimonies were delivered with a clinical, detached clarity that stood in stark, jarring contrast to the horrific nature of the acts being described. Every fragment of the victim's remains, every trace of biological material found at the various disposal sites, was systematically connected back to the defendant. The prosecution transformed the courtroom into a place of absolute, scientific accountability, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that it was not a stranger who had committed this atrocity, but the very man standing before them, a man who had utilized the local geography as an instrument of his crime. The methodical presentation of this evidence forced the reality of the murder into the light, stripping away the mystery and revealing the calculated, monstrous intent that had driven Modger to commit such an unforgivable act. During the proceedings, the defense faced an insurmountable challenge. Attempting to provide a coherent, believable, or even moderately plausible alternative to the overwhelming avalanche of forensic facts was a task that bordered on the impossible. The prosecution had effectively built a fortress of evidence, leaving almost no room for maneuver, denial, or obfuscation. Richard Modger, sitting in the courtroom, was a figure of unsettling, chilling detachment. Throughout the trial, he remained largely passive, a silent observer of his own undoing. This demeanor, rather than suggesting a man suffering from shock or remorse, served only to reinforce the chilling, clinical nature of his initial premeditation. The defense was forced into a strategy of procedural questioning, attempting to cast doubts on the handling of evidence or the precision of the investigative techniques, but these efforts were largely swallowed by the crushing weight of the DNA findings. The courtroom became a stage where the internal, dark logic of Modger's premeditated crime was systematically exposed, analyzed, and ultimately rejected by the principles of justice. There were no hidden motives left to uncover, no surprise revelations to shift the trajectory of the trial. The truth had been thoroughly and scientifically unearthed, leaving the defense with little more than the hollow, ineffective attempt to mitigate the inevitable outcome. The testimonies provided by the witnesses, those who had known the victim, those who had seen the two men together, and those involved in the harrowing, months-long search, provided the human, emotional, and cultural context that the cold, scientific evidence could not fully capture. Their voices carried the burden of the community's loss and the visceral, lingering horror of the discovery. They spoke of Wyatt Bowles Jr. not as a statistic, but as a valued, integral part of the society, emphasizing the profound, permanent void his death had left in the lives of those around him. These accounts, delivered with a raw, painful, and deeply felt authenticity, brought the tragedy out of the abstract and into the absolute, heartbreaking reality of daily existence on the islands. They grounded the proceedings in the fundamental truth that a real human life, with all its potential and connections, had been silenced in the most brutal manner. The contrast between these testimonies and the silent, cold demeanor of the defendant created a powerful, silent narrative within the courtroom, one that spoke directly to the core of why this case had so deeply, so permanently wounded the public conscience. It was a clear, vivid reminder that the justice being sought was not just for the law, but for the humanity that had been so aggressively and maliciously violated. As the trial neared its conclusion, the legal process shifted from the presentation of evidence to the formal, final determination of the consequences of the crime. The High Court of American Samoa was tasked with delivering a sentence that reflected the singular, horrific, and extreme nature of Modger's actions. The courtroom was filled with an intense, expectant, and heavy silence as the judges deliberated on the appropriate punishment for a crime that had, in every sense of the word, pushed the boundaries of human depravity. The law of the territory, while rooted in standard, established principles of justice, had to be interpreted here in light of a murder that involved not only a calculated killing, but a sickening, manual process of post-mortem dismemberment. This added layer of violence, this deliberate, persistent desecration of the victim, meant that the sentencing could not simply follow the conventional, standard guidelines. It had to be, in its own way, an act of societal rejection of the perpetrator. The deliberation process was not merely about assessing the weight of the crime, but about defining the moral, legal, and protective standards that would guide the territory's future, ensuring that such a monster could never again be permitted to threaten the peace and the security of the island's community. When the verdict and the subsequent sentence were finally delivered, the atmosphere in the courtroom reached an overwhelming peak of somber, profound finality. Richard Modger was found guilty on all counts, his carefully engineered plans and his reliance on the island's isolation having failed him completely. The sentence imposed was an unprecedented, resounding, and absolute declaration. 50 years of imprisonment, with an ironclad, non-negotiable provision that precluded any possibility of parole, early release, or mercy. It was, for all practical purposes, a sentence of lifetime exile from the world. This was not a punishment designed for rehabilitation or eventual reintegration into society. It was a sentence of permanent, total isolation, an attempt to mirror, in the legal system's own way, the absolute and final erasure that Modger had sought to inflict upon his victim. The 50-year, no-parole sentence was the judicial system's response to the depth of the betrayal Modger had committed against the community's shared values. It was a message delivered with total clarity, stating that in American Samoa, there was no place for individuals who could act with such base, unmitigated, and calculated evil. The severity of the punishment stood as a monument to the integrity of the law, a definitive, final, and unyielding barrier placed between the convicted murderer and the society he had so brutally, so irrevocably stained. The finality of the sentence brought to a close the most dramatic, public chapter of the tragedy, yet it did not, and could not, truly undo the horrific damage that had been done. The trial had succeeded in its primary goal. It had established the truth of the crime, held the perpetrator fully accountable, and provided the legal, institutional closure that the community desperately needed. The process, however, served as a permanent, chilling, and essential reminder of the vulnerability of even the most tight-knit and traditional societies to the intrusion of deep-seated, systemic, and murderous malice. The courtroom, once empty, would no longer hold the physical presence of the murderer, yet the legacy of the trial, the evidence, and the brutal reality of the crime would remain, woven into the fabric of the island's collective history. The sentence was more than a mere legal document. It was a declaration of the community's values, a firm, principled statement that the murder of Wyatt Bowles Jr. had left a void that could never be filled, and that the only response to such an act was the permanent, absolute, and unyielding isolation of the monster responsible. The judicial system had done its work. The truth had been spoken, the monster had been condemned, and the, at times, agonizing path to justice had finally, and unequivocally, reached its end in the hallowed, solemn halls of the High Court. The conclusion of a legal proceeding is never truly the end of a story, especially when that story is defined by a crime that shatters the very foundations of communal trust. When the gavel finally fell in the High Court of American Samoa in 2006, delivering the 50-year, no parole sentence to Richard Modger. The judicial system fulfilled its duty to the letter of the law, yet the resonance of the tragedy continued to ripple outward, touching every corner of the island territory. This was not a case that could be neatly packed away into an archive of resolved files. The murder of Wyatt Bowles Jr. was a trauma that fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of American Samoa, forcing its residents to reconcile their idealized vision of their home with the chilling, undeniable reality of what had been committed within their borders. For a society that relies so heavily on the interconnectedness of its people, the revelation that one of their own had not only harbored such profound malice, but had acted upon it with such clinical, systematic brutality, served as a permanent, cautionary lesson in the dangers of complacency and the fragility of peace. The aftermath of the trial became a period of quiet, collective reflection, as the community grappled with the burden of remembering a life that had been so cruelly erased and acknowledging the monster who had once walked among them as a neighbor. The life of Wyatt Bowles Jr., now forever memorialized through the lens of this horrific tragedy, deserves more than the role of a passive victim in a cautionary tale. To remember him is to acknowledge the void his absence created in the lives of his family, his friends, and the wider community that had once been sustained by his presence. In the years that have followed, his memory has served as a touchstone for the territory, a reminder of the need for vigilance and the importance of fostering a society that is not only built on tradition and proximity, but also on a proactive awareness of the darkness that can take root in any heart, regardless of how idyllic the setting may be. The investigation and trial prove that the island's physical isolation was not a defense against evil, but rather an environment that demanded a more robust, scientifically grounded, and transparent approach to justice. The professionalization of forensic capabilities and the commitment to pursuing the truth, no matter how difficult or remote the path, became the legacy of this investigation. It stands as a testament to the fact that while a perpetrator may seek to hide their crimes in the deepest shadows, the collective resolve of a community backed by the relentless, objective truth of science will ultimately force those crimes into the light of accountability. For Richard Modger, the sentence of 50 years without the possibility of parole was more than just a duration of confinement. It was a total, absolute, and permanent exile from the life he had sought to preserve through murder. The weight of his conviction is not measured in the calendar years he serves behind bars, but in the total, irrevocable loss of his position in the society he had violated. He is a person who has effectively ceased to exist in the world he once occupied, his name now inextricably linked to the darkest, most indelible chapter in the history of American Samoa. His existence has been reduced to the confines of a prison cell, a small, controlled, and isolated space that stands in stark, ironic contrast to the expansive, verdant wilderness he once hoped would serve as his shroud. He represents the living embodiment of the consequences of allowing internal grievances to metastasize into external violence. His case remains a dark, essential study in the psychology of dehumanization, a stark reminder of the capacity of the human mind to rationalize the most extreme acts of brutality when it is allowed to fester in isolation, away from the tempering influences of empathy, reason, and social accountability. He is the cautionary figure that this community will continue to look upon as a symbol of the ultimate transgression, a warning against the potential for human malice to destroy the very things that define us. The impact of this case on the legal and investigative infrastructure of American Samoa cannot be understated. The sheer logistical nightmare of the search for Wyatt Bowles Jr., combined with the complex, scientific rigor required to build a case against Modger, forced the territory to reckon with its own investigative limitations. The success of the prosecution, anchored by the irrefutable testimony of biological evidence, set a new, high-water mark for the standards of justice in the region. It catalyzed a greater appreciation for the power of forensic science and the importance of maintaining, even in the most remote environments, the highest levels of professional inquiry and procedural integrity. The memory of this case serves as a silent partner to every investigator, every judge, and every officer of the law in the territory, a constant reminder that the pursuit of justice is not merely a bureaucratic process, but a profound moral obligation to the victims and their families. It has necessitated a more proactive, technologically adept, and scientifically informed approach to public safety, ensuring that should such a shadow ever fall upon the island again, the machinery of justice would be ready, equipped, and more than capable of rising to the challenge. Yet, beyond the legal and systemic changes, there remains the profound, lingering question of how a community recovers from such a violation of its own peace. Recovery, in this context, is not a return to a state of pre-tragedy innocence. That innocence was shattered the moment the truth of Wyatt's death was revealed. Instead, recovery is a gradual, ongoing process of integration, of acknowledging the tragedy, honoring the life of the victim, and moving forward with a renewed commitment to the values that sustain their society. The residents of American Samoa have, over the years, found ways to heal that are deeply rooted in their own traditions and their own unique collective identity. They have learned to hold the memory of Wyatt Bowles Jr. not as a source of paralyzing fear, but as a motivation to strengthen the ties that bind them together. They have developed a heightened sensitivity to the subtle shifts in their community, a greater willingness to intervene in the conflicts of others before they escalate, and a more profound understanding that their safety is a shared responsibility, not an inherent or guaranteed state of being. The tragedy, as painful as it was, has served to deepen the resilience of the community, turning the collective mourning into a form of active, preventative vigilance that protects the peace of the islands. The legacy of this story is ultimately one of light overcoming the darkness, of the truth prevailing over the most calculated, deceitful attempts at concealment. The wilderness of American Samoa, once utilized by a monster as a graveyard for his secrets, has returned to its place as a symbol of the natural, untamed beauty of the islands. It no longer holds the weight of the crime in the same way, for the mystery has been solved, the injustice has been addressed, and the perpetrator has been removed. The story of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and Richard Modger is now a part of the permanent historical record, a narrative that is passed down as a lesson in the complexity of human nature and the necessity of justice. It reminds us that we are all, in a sense, responsible for one another, and that the silence of the forest is no sanctuary for those who would violate the sanctity of life. In the quiet, humid air of the Pacific, where the ocean meets the steep, volcanic mountains, the memory of this event endures as a silent, solemn sentinel, ensuring that the life of Wyatt Bowles Jr. is not forgotten and that the moral fabric of the community remains strong, intact, and ever vigilant against the darkness that can arrive from within. The final, enduring takeaway is the absolute certainty that no crime, no matter how deeply buried or how cruelly committed, can ever truly exist outside the reach of the truth, for the truth, like the rising sun over the vast, expansive ocean, is inevitable, inescapable, and fundamentally the only thing that can ever offer the promise of final, true resolution. This case remains, and will forever remain, a fundamental, non-negotiable anchor in the moral history of the territory, a reminder that the path to justice is long, arduous, and sometimes incredibly painful, but it is a path that must always be followed to its end, for the sake of the victim, for the sake of the truth, and for the sake of the future of the community itself. Every step taken, every piece of evidence discovered, and every day of the sentence served is a testament to the fact that the human spirit, when confronted with the most horrific of circumstances, possesses the enduring, unshakable capacity to demand and to achieve a measure of accountability that mirrors the gravity of the crime, thereby ensuring that even in the face of absolute, systemic evil, the light of justice remains the brightest, most persistent, and most final force in our shared mortal existence. The final, reflective resonance of the case of American Samoa versus Richard Modger is not merely found in the cold facts of the criminal record or the harsh finality of the sentencing, but in the enduring, quiet impact it left upon the collective consciousness of the territory. To look back at this tragic chapter is to confront the fragility of the peace that exists in any community, regardless of its geographic isolation or the warmth of its social fabric. The murder of Wyatt Bowles Jr. functioned as a devastating lens, focusing the attention of the entire region on the reality that even in a landscape defined by shared ancestry, mutual reliance, and the enduring rhythms of tradition, the capacity for profound, premeditated violence exists within the human heart. The trauma was not just a singular event. It was a permanent shift in how the community understood the relationship between the individual and the collective. It forced a realization that the safety they had long taken for granted was, in truth, something that had to be actively maintained, defended, and protected. The aftermath of the case did not bring about a cynical, fearful society, but rather one that became more deeply conscious of its internal tensions and more vigilant in its commitment to the interpersonal well-being of every resident. The memory of the victim, Wyatt Bowles Jr., has transcended the role of a tragic figure in a gruesome case, evolving into a symbol of the community's commitment to moral integrity and the preservation of human value. His life, which had once been defined by the daily, intimate interactions of small island existence, now occupies a solemn place in the history of American Samoa, serving as a reminder that every human life is a vital, irreplaceable component of the social whole. The grief experienced by his family and those closest to him was, in the immediate wake of the crime, a raw and agonizing force that demanded accountability. In the years that have since passed, that grief has been channeled into a quiet, enduring legacy. The territory has not turned its back on the tragedy. Rather, it has integrated the lesson of the event into its cultural fabric. There is a greater appreciation for the importance of addressing interpersonal conflict before it spirals into catastrophe, a more robust and supportive network of community engagement, and an unwavering, collective refusal to let the shadow of one man's monstrous actions define the character of the entire island. The legacy of Wyatt Bowles Jr. is, ultimately, the preservation of the humanity that he represented, a humanity that Modger sought to destroy but ultimately failed to silence. For the judicial system of American Samoa, the case of Richard Modger remains a touchstone of legal and investigative rigor. It serves as an essential example of the necessity of maintaining the highest standards of evidence, procedure, and objective inquiry, even when the pressure of public opinion or the desire for rapid resolution might suggest otherwise. The prosecutors, the police investigators, and the judiciary involved in the trial were tasked with navigating a path through an extraordinary set of challenges, from the logistical difficulties of the search to the complex, forensic demands of the prosecution. Their success in bringing Modger to justice is remembered not just as a victory of the law, but as a victory of the truth over a meticulously crafted, calculated deception. The influence of the investigation can be seen in the subsequent improvements to how the territory manages criminal inquiries, ensuring that no matter the location or the difficulty of the terrain, the tools of forensic science are always at the forefront of the search for the truth. The trial stands as a monumental, permanent barrier against the normalization of extreme violence, a clear statement that the law is an absolute, immutable shield for the community, regardless of the individual motivations or the efforts to subvert it from within. The internal state of Richard Modger, now relegated to the life of a permanent, isolated prisoner, serves as the ultimate, chilling counterpoint to the life he chose to destroy. His existence, stripped of all agency and removed from the world he once sought to manipulate, is a direct, living consequence of his own choices. He is no longer a person of influence, a man with social standing, or a member of the community. He is a cautionary, singular figure, defined solely by the gravity of his transgression. The absence of any possibility of parole, the utter and total rejection by the society he had offended, and the permanent removal of his freedom constitute a punishment that is as absolute as the crime was heinous. His journey from a person who harbored toxic, festering grievances to a man who executed a cold-blooded murder and attempted to erase his victim is a tragic, absolute warning about the dangers of unchecked malice. It is a reminder that the human mind, when left to dwell on resentment without the tempering influence of external perspectives or moral restraint, can descend into a state of total, catastrophic inhumanity. Modger's life is now a testament to the fact that the path of the murderer is a path that leads only to total, self-inflicted destruction, a realization that is perhaps the final, silent judgment on his actions. As the years continue to pass, the narrative of this case will inevitably evolve, yet its core, essential truth will remain fixed. The truth of the murder, the truth of the investigation, and the truth of the justice that was served. The landscape of American Samoa, with its dramatic volcanic peaks and its hidden, verdant interiors, has long since resumed its natural, unhurried rhythm. The forest, which once served as the site of a brutal, hidden atrocity, is now once again merely a part of the vast, beautiful wilderness of the islands. The events of 2003 have been folded into the history of the land, becoming a part of the collective memory that is passed down, not as a source of ongoing fear, but as an essential, foundational truth of the territory's journey toward justice. The community has moved forward, not by forgetting, but by acknowledging, learning, and strengthening its commitment to the values of mutual respect, safety, and the absolute sanctity of life. The story of Wyatt Bowles Jr. is now a permanent, silent guardian in the history of the island, a reminder that the light of truth and the integrity of the law are the only forces that can truly conquer the darkness. The broader lesson that this case imparts, to anyone who studies it, is the profound, inescapable reality that violence is not a problem that can be relegated to the anonymous, urban centers of the world. It is an element of the human condition that can manifest anywhere, in any community, no matter how remote, how traditional, or how ostensibly peaceful the setting. The strength of a community is not measured by the absence of conflict, but by the manner in which it addresses, resolves, and holds accountable those who violate the essential, moral compact of human coexistence. The case of American Samoa versus Richard Modger is a, perhaps, uncomfortable but absolutely necessary demonstration of this principle. It shows that even in the face of the most calculated, monstrous betrayal, a society can stand firm, can demand the truth, and can successfully administer justice in a way that preserves its integrity and reaffirms its core values. The finality of the sentence, the precision of the investigation, and the quiet, collective resilience of the community in the aftermath of the trial collectively represent the most powerful and most lasting response to the crime. Ultimately, the story of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and Richard Modger is a narrative of profound, individual loss, but also one of profound, collective strength. It is a story that forces us to confront the reality of the darkness, yet it also provides the inspiration to continue building, nurturing, and protecting the light. The path of the investigator, the path of the witness, and the path of the judiciary in this case were all directed toward the same, singular, essential goal: the establishment of the truth and the achievement of justice. In fulfilling that goal, they ensured that the memory of Wyatt Bowles Jr. would not be defined by the violence he suffered, but by the society's refusal to let that violence be the final, defining note of his existence. The case remains a beacon of accountability, a landmark in the history of American Samoa, and an enduring, solemn reminder that no matter how deep the shadows, the truth, when pursued with resolve, patience, and unwavering dedication, will always, inevitably, come to light. The final, resonant takeaway is a testament to the capacity of the community to endure, to learn, and to stand as a united, principled entity, ensuring that the sanctity of human life remains the highest, most protected value, even in the most remote, forgotten, and silent corners of the world. The story ends, as it must, with the clear, unshakable certainty that justice, despite the agonizing, long, and often painful road, remains the only path forward, the only promise of resolution, and the only final, true measure of our collective commitment to the preservation of our shared human existence. The final echoes of the case of American Samoa versus Richard Modger linger not as a haunting refrain, but as a testament to the enduring capacity of a society to reconcile with its own darkest vulnerabilities. In the years that have unfolded since the final verdict in 2006, the territory has continued to evolve, weaving the memory of the tragic death of Wyatt Bowles Jr. into its ongoing narrative of growth, vigilance, and resilience. This story, in its entirety, serves as a bridge between the innocence that characterized the island's perception of itself and the mature, sober reality that has since taken its place. The process of moving forward has never been about erasing the memory of the crime. It has been about ensuring that the memory serves as a permanent, functional part of the community's defensive structure. The institutional memory of the American Samoa Police Force, the ongoing commitment of the legal system to forensic excellence, and the quiet, persistent honor paid to the victim by the community at large, all these elements coalesce to form a bulwark against any recurrence of such an atrocity. The lesson taught by this tragedy is embedded in the way the territory now approaches the management of internal friction, moving beyond the traditional reliance on social cohesion to a more robust, proactive framework that values transparency, objective observation, and the early identification of potentially volatile, dehumanizing patterns of behavior. The evolution of the island's judicial landscape is perhaps the most tangible legacy of this harrowing ordeal. The meticulous 3-year investigative process that led to the conviction of Richard Modger did more than just secure a guilty verdict. It established a new, high-water mark for the standards of professionalism expected of the territory's law enforcement and legal professionals. The shift toward a more scientifically grounded, forensic-led approach has provided the community with a sense of security that is rooted in objective reality rather than mere assumption. This shift has not been limited to the technical application of science, but has permeated the entire culture of the justice system, fostering a deep-seated commitment to the thoroughness, impartiality, and patience required to handle the most complex and sensitive of cases. The legacy of this case acts as a silent mentor to every new investigator, reminding them that the path to justice is rarely straightforward, that the most difficult of cases require an unyielding adherence to the facts, and that the ultimate purpose of their work is to serve as the voice for those who have been robbed of their own. This institutional commitment ensures that the territory remains a place where the truth is not just sought, but demanded, and where the machinery of justice is always refined, prepared, and ready to meet the most extreme challenges with unwavering scientific certainty. Beyond the halls of justice, the impact of this case continues to resonate within the day-to-day interactions of the island's residents. There is a perceptible, enduring shift in the way the community views the nature of interpersonal conflict. The tragedy of Wyatt Bowles Jr. serves as a constant, silent caution against the dangers of allowing grievances to remain hidden, to ferment, and to mutate into a destructive, internal obsession. The social fabric of American Samoa, while still deeply rooted in the traditions and mutual reliance of the past, now includes a layer of awareness that allows for a more constructive, open approach to resolving disagreements. The community understands that the silence of the forest is not a safe place for anyone, and that the only true path to maintaining the sanctity of their island paradise is to foster an environment where issues are brought into the light, addressed with honesty, and resolved through the collective wisdom and moral support of the entire society. This preventative vigilance, born of a profound, shared loss, is perhaps the most significant and heartening outcome of the long, painful road that followed the events of 2003. It is a form of collective healing that honors the victim by ensuring that the conditions that allowed his murderer to operate remain firmly in the past, replaced by a culture that prioritizes the health of the individual and the harmony of the whole. The story of Richard Modger, confined to the sterile, permanent reality of his 50-year, no-parole sentence, provides the final, chilling bookend to this chapter of the territory's history. His life, while physically contained, continues to serve as a stark, living illustration of the path of total, self-inflicted exile. There is a profound, quiet weight to his existence, an ongoing, lived acknowledgement of the consequences of abandoning the moral compact of human society. For the residents of American Samoa, he is not a figure of fear, but a figure of complete social irrelevance. A person who chose to step outside the bounds of human decency and was, in return, removed from the human community entirely. The total, non-negotiable nature of his sentence acts as a definitive final word, a legislative and moral boundary that the territory has drawn in the sand, marking the point beyond which no individual can pass without forfeiting their place among the living, functioning members of the society. His existence in prison is the physical manifestation of the territory's rejection of his actions, a constant, unchanging reminder that the value of human life is the highest priority, and that any attempt to violate that value will be met with the full, unyielding force of the law. As we conclude this retrospective on the life and death of Wyatt Bowles Jr., we are left with a final, overwhelming sense of the power of the truth to eventually transcend even the most desperate, calculated, and monstrous of efforts at concealment. The journey from the initial discovery of the tragedy in the deep, silent wilderness to the final, solemn declaration of justice in the High Court of American Samoa was one defined by the steady, unswerving dedication of those who refused to let the darkness prevail. The narrative of this case is not merely about the murder. It is about the response to that murder. The response of the investigators, the response of the witnesses, the response of the community, and the response of the judicial system. Each of these responses, when taken together, represents a monumental, unified commitment to the principles of truth, accountability, and justice. The final, resonant takeaway is that the light of the truth is the most enduring and effective weapon against the darkness of human cruelty. No matter how remote the geography, no matter how deep the shadows, and no matter how arrogant the attempts of the perpetrator to manipulate the situation, the truth will eventually force its way into the light, demanding its due. The memory of Wyatt Bowles Jr. is now, and will forever be, anchored in the history of American Samoa, a permanent, quiet, and sacred part of the island's collective identity. The tragedy has been integrated into the cultural consciousness, transformed from a moment of raw, devastating horror into a moment of lasting, moral clarity. It is a story that is passed on, not as a celebration of the crime, but as a reflection on the strength, the resilience, and the moral integrity of the people who were tested by it. It stands as an enduring, solemn monument to the fact that a community is more than just a collection of individuals. It is a shared, moral responsibility, a bond that must be protected, nurtured, and held sacred above all else. The final, lingering feeling left by this case is one of profound, sober resolution. The path taken was long and, at times, incredibly painful, but it was the only path that could lead to a final, true sense of closure for the victim's family, for the community, and for the territory itself. The ultimate, final, and true measure of the society's response to this atrocity is its decision to not only seek justice, but to learn, to grow, and to emerge from the experience as a stronger, more united, and more profoundly committed guardian of the sanctity of human life. The story concludes with the clear, unwavering knowledge that despite the depths of the darkness encountered, the commitment of the people of American Samoa to the truth remained unbroken, providing a roadmap for resolution, a promise of peace, and a clear, enduring testament to the fact that justice, when pursued with honesty, integrity, and resolve, will always, ultimately, find its way home. The profound, lingering narrative of the American Samoa versus Richard Modger case concludes by weaving together the disparate threads of tragedy, scientific inquiry, and judicial finality into a singular, cohesive testament to the strength of human resolve. Throughout this exhaustive exploration of the year 2003, we have witnessed how an act of extreme, isolated violence can become a pivotal event that reshapes the moral and operational landscape of an entire territory. The life of Wyatt Bowles Jr., which was so violently interrupted in the deep, verdant mountain wilderness, has transcended its initial parameters of victimhood to become a permanent, solemn sentinel in the history of the island. His story serves as a reminder that every individual life is a fundamental, irreplaceable unit of the social fabric, and that the loss of any one person resonates with the force of a tectonic shift through the closely interconnected lives of a community. The process of justice, while spanning 3 agonizing, transformative years, functioned as a necessary, purging mechanism that allowed the territory to systematically dismantle the darkness, analyze its components, and ultimately reject it through the clear, unyielding application of the law. The scientific methodology that underpinned the investigation, particularly the focus on biological and forensic evidence, stands as the most critical takeaway for future generations. The realization that even in the most inaccessible and rugged terrain, the reality of a crime remains embedded in the physical evidence is a lesson that has permanently altered the investigative philosophy of the region. This case demonstrated with absolute clarity that the era of relying solely on witness testimony, local knowledge, or circumstantial reasoning had been decisively superseded by the objective, irrefutable power of forensic science. The transition from the desperate, manual labor of the search teams in the thick of the jungle to the sterile, precise environment of the DNA laboratory marked the evolution of American Samoan justice into a modern, sophisticated endeavor. This evolution is the lasting, positive outcome of the tragedy, ensuring that no perpetrator, no matter how cunning, how patient, or how familiar with a local environment, can ever assume they have achieved the perfect, untraceable crime. The commitment to this scientific standard serves as a permanent, protective barrier for the community, a guarantee that the machinery of justice will always be equipped to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it may be buried within the shadows of the island. Furthermore, the social transformation within the territory, born from the collective mourning and the subsequent steady path toward resolution, is perhaps the most humanizing aspect of this entire account. The community of American Samoa did not fragment under the pressure of such a horrific event. Instead, they demonstrated a profound, resilient capacity to bond together in their commitment to justice and their refusal to let the shadow of the perpetrator define their future. The internal dynamics of the island, the way neighbors relate to one another, the way they communicate, and the way they provide support in the face of adversity, have all been subtly, yet permanently, strengthened by the memory of this event. The tragedy served as a profound wake-up call regarding the dangers of social isolation and the necessity of maintaining open, honest lines of communication within the community. It reminded everyone that the peace they enjoy is not a natural, inevitable state of being, but a carefully tended, collective creation that requires the active participation and vigilance of every individual. By embracing this responsibility, the people of the islands have honored the memory of Wyatt Bowles Jr., transforming his tragic death into a source of enduring communal strength. Richard Modger, in his permanent, state-mandated exile from the world, remains a figure of singular, cautionary importance. His presence, or rather his total absence from the society he once inhabited, serves as a living illustration of the consequences of allowing the darker impulses of the human heart to dictate one's existence. He is a man who possessed the freedom of the island, the connections of the community, and the potential for a normal life. Yet he chose to systematically dismantle all of those things in pursuit of an objective that was born of toxicity, resentment, and a total abandonment of morality. The sentence of 50 years without the possibility of parole is, in its own way, a mirror reflection of the absolute, final destruction he sought to inflict on his victim. It is a sentence that offers no hope of reintegration, no promise of redemption, and no chance of a return to the society he so fundamentally betrayed. For those who study his case, he stands as a stark, uncompromising warning against the dangers of unchecked ego, the toxicity of unresolved grievance, and the catastrophic, irreversible error of believing that one can ever truly separate themselves from the moral constraints of the human family. The legacy of the High Court of American Samoa's decision in 2006 continues to exert a powerful, stabilizing influence on the legal culture of the region. The verdict was a definitive, monumental rejection of the idea that extreme violence can be managed or understood outside of the strict, unyielding framework of the law. By imposing the maximum possible penalty, the court sent an unambiguous, echoing message that the sanctity of human life is the absolute, highest value in their society, and that any attempt to violate that sanctity, no matter how calculated or hidden, will be met with the full, unyielding, and irreversible force of justice. This legal standard is the bedrock upon which the future of the territory is built, providing the security and the moral clarity that allows the community to pursue its aspirations without the constant, gnawing fear of the unknown. It is a standard that has been tested in the crucible of the most extreme, unimaginable circumstances and has emerged refined, strengthened, and ready for the challenges of the future. In the final assessment, the story of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and Richard Modger is a narrative of profound loss. Yet it is also a narrative that highlights the enduring, unshakable human capacity to demand and achieve justice. It is a story that forces us to look into the abyss, to acknowledge the capacity for monstrous acts in the most unlikely of places, and to then turn away and commit ourselves, with renewed vigor, to the preservation of the light. The journey from the initial, devastating discovery of the victim in the remote, verdant thickets of the interior to the final, solemn pronouncement in the courtroom was a journey that demanded everything of those involved, from the investigators who braved the elements to the families who endured the agonizing, years-long wait for the truth to be revealed. They did not waver, they did not retreat, and they did not falter. And in their persistence, they ensured that the memory of the victim would remain dignified, that the perpetrator would be held fully accountable, and that the moral fabric of their community would remain, in the end, unshattered. We are left with the undeniable, comforting, and fundamentally important conclusion that truth is the most persistent force in our shared, mortal experience. It is a force that operates regardless of the complexity of the deceit, the remoteness of the location, or the passage of time. It is a force that, when combined with the dedication of those who are committed to its discovery, will always, eventually, overcome the shadows. The memory of this case will continue to serve as an anchor for the people of American Samoa, a reminder that while the path through the darkness can be long, tortuous, and profoundly painful, it is a path that, if walked with integrity, honesty, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, will always lead to the promise of final, true resolution. The community stands today as a testament to this, having navigated the most extreme of human trials and emerged on the other side, united, informed, and more profoundly committed than ever to the preservation of the values that define their existence. The story reaches its final, inevitable resolution with the realization that justice is not merely an outcome to be achieved, but a continuous, vigilant, and absolutely vital process that defines our humanity, protects our future, and provides the only true, lasting hope for the resolution of the greatest, most profound tragedies of our lives. The case is closed, the monster is removed, the victim is honored, and the territory, in the quiet, expansive beauty of the Pacific, continues to move forward into a future that is defined by the light of the truth, the strength of the community, and the unyielding, final, and ever-present promise of justice for all. The ultimate, concluding reflection on the tragedy of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and the subsequent judicial reckoning of Richard Modger necessitates a departure from the particulars of the crime to an examination of the broader, existential lessons inherent in such a profound disruption of communal order. To engage with this history is to acknowledge the uncomfortable, universal reality that the boundary between the orderly, predictable flow of daily life and the chaotic, savage manifestation of extreme violence is significantly thinner and more porous than we, as members of a civilized society, would prefer to believe. The case does not merely exist as a localized, historical footnote in the annals of American Samoa. Rather, it functions as a mirror, forcing us to look at the fragility of our own social compacts and the latent capacity for moral collapse that exists, albeit suppressed, within every community. The enduring, solemn value of this narrative lies in its ability to strip away the comforting illusions of safety and permanence, compelling us to recognize that the preservation of human life and the maintenance of justice require an active, intentional, and perpetual effort that never truly reaches a final state of completion. The role of the investigators and the legal professionals in this case stands as an exemplar of the dedication required to uphold the integrity of the law in the face of absolute, systemic depravity. They operated in an environment where the physical evidence was not only sparse and dispersed, but actively concealed by a perpetrator who demonstrated a cold, methodical understanding of the geography he sought to manipulate. Yet, they did not succumb to the temptation of convenience, the pressure of public anxiety, or the logistical despair that accompanies such immense physical challenges. They understood that the pursuit of justice is not a sprint, but an endurance-based undertaking, one that demands a rigid, uncompromising adherence to the scientific method. By allowing the biological evidence to speak for itself, they neutralized the deceitful, manipulative narrative of the murderer and established a foundation of truth that could withstand the scrutiny of the highest courts. This unwavering commitment is the greatest tribute that could be paid to Wyatt Bowles Jr., for it affirmed that his life had an objective, undeniable value that demanded the full weight of the legal system to be vindicated, regardless of the time, effort, or difficulty involved in achieving that objective. The psychological dimension of Richard Modger's journey, from a person within the community to an individual entirely severed from it, offers a harrowing exploration into the mechanics of self-destruction. His case is not a simple tale of criminal intent, but a comprehensive study of how a human mind, when consumed by the slow, parasitic growth of resentment and the absence of social correction, can systematically justify the most extreme, irreversible transgressions. The absence of parole in his sentence is the formal, societal recognition of this total, irreparable rupture. It signifies that there is a point beyond which an individual can traverse, a threshold of moral violation so severe that the possibility of future reintegration becomes a fundamental contradiction of the principles the society seeks to uphold. His existence is now a vacuum, a hollowed-out remnant of a life once integrated into the island's culture, serving as a permanent, cautionary monument to the consequences of abandoning empathy. It is the final, logical, and inevitable outcome of a path that prioritized the satisfaction of a murderous, internal grievance over the sanctity of the human connections that constitute our very existence. As we look toward the future, the legacy of this case ensures that American Samoa remains a territory that is profoundly aware of the weight of its own history. The integration of this memory into the broader identity of the islands is not a burden to be carried with despair, but a source of strength that informs the territory's commitment to the future. The resilience of the people who experienced the shock, the grief, and the agonizing process of the trial has been tempered and hardened by the ordeal, leading to a culture that is more transparent, more supportive, and more profoundly attuned to the nuances of its own social health. The tragedy taught the territory that the true security of an island is not determined by its geographic distance from the world, but by the depth of the commitment of its people to one another. It is this realization, that their strength lies not in their isolation, but in their solidarity, that defines their path forward, creating a society that is not only vigilant against the potential for external threats, but, more importantly, proactively nurturing the internal conditions that prevent the seeds of such darkness from ever taking root again. The narrative of this tragedy also provides a profound, clarifying insight into the nature of human resolution. Closure, in the aftermath of a murder so calculated and savage, is a deceptive term. There is no final point at which the grief of the family, the loss of the community, or the weight of the injustice entirely vanishes. Instead, there is the arrival at a state of integration, where the event no longer dominates the present, but is accepted as a foundational, albeit painful, part of the past. The community has achieved this integration by refusing to allow the narrative to be controlled by the perpetrator. They have taken the raw, agonizing reality of the murder and the scientific clarity of the investigation and turned it into a story of persistent, unyielding justice. By doing so, they have honored the humanity of Wyatt Bowles Jr., ensuring that he is remembered not for the way his life ended, but for the profound, collective determination of his society to ensure that his death would not go unanswered. This is the only form of true resolution that is possible in the face of such extreme, systemic evil. A resolution that is built not on the erasure of the tragedy, but on the enduring, collective promise that justice, once demanded, will be achieved. In our broader, global context, the story of this island case holds a universal significance that transcends the specific volcanic geography of the Pacific. It serves as a reminder to all societies, regardless of their size, history, or social structure, that the law is not an abstract concept, but a living, breathing, and fundamentally necessary instrument of human survival. It reminds us that every act of violence, every attempt to conceal the truth, and every instance of systemic injustice is a challenge to the entire moral architecture of our shared existence. When a community stands together, as the people of American Samoa did, to demand that the truth be revealed and that justice be served, they are contributing to the universal, ongoing struggle to maintain the light of human decency against the encroachment of the dark. Their experience is a beacon for those who may face similar, harrowing trials, a testament that no matter how isolated one might feel in their grief or how overwhelming the odds against the truth, there's an inherent, invincible, and final power in the demand for accountability. We reach the final, inevitable conclusion that the story of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and Richard Modger is, in its essence, a story of the triumph of human integrity. It is a testament to the fact that when we, as individuals and as communities, commit ourselves to the pursuit of the truth, we are participating in a process that is larger, more enduring, and more significant than any single temporary act of violence. The memory of the victim, the labor of the investigators, the resolution of the court, and the collective growth of the community all combine to form a singular, coherent force that has permanently marked the history of the territory. The darkness that once shrouded the remote, silent thickets of the interior has been entirely and irrevocably dispelled, replaced by the enduring, clear, and ever-present light of a justice that was fought for, earned, and ultimately established. The case is, and shall always remain, an immutable part of the territory's journey, a story that will continue to be told not with a sense of lingering horror, but with a sense of pride in the resilience, the clarity, and the unshakable moral resolve of a people who, when faced with the absolute, existential threat of an internal monster, chose to stand, to speak, and to act. As the story concludes, we are left with the profound, quiet realization that while the world may occasionally be darkened by the most extreme manifestations of human malice, it is our collective, persistent, and unwavering commitment to the light of truth, the light of reason, and the light of justice, that will always, ultimately, serve as our final, true, and permanent protection against the dark, guiding us toward a future that is defined not by the memory of the tragedy, but by the dignity of the resolution that followed. The final, lingering echoes of the tragedy that befell Wyatt Bowles Jr. in the verdant, volcanic heart of American Samoa nearly a quarter-century ago provide us with a singular opportunity to contemplate the nature of human morality and the persistent necessity of judicial accountability. As we stand at this chronological distance, looking back upon the grim events of 2003 and the subsequent judicial reckoning of 2006, we are not merely recounting a historical event, but exploring the permanent architecture of a society that has been fundamentally tempered by fire. The story has moved beyond the raw, visceral shock of the murder and the clinical, methodical precision of the investigation, settling instead into the collective consciousness of a territory that has learned the hard, invaluable lesson of its own fragility. To conclude this exhaustive narrative is to recognize that justice, while often perceived as an end state, is more accurately described as a constant, evolving commitment, a perpetual, daily decision by a community to prioritize the truth, to protect the vulnerable, and to ensure that the silence of the wilderness is never again permitted to serve as a shroud for the monstrous. The legacy of this case remains intimately tied to the technological and procedural evolution that it necessitated within the territory's legal and law enforcement infrastructure. The shift from an investigative model based on local intuition and historical familiarity to one defined by the rigorous, objective, and irrefutable testimony of DNA analysis represented a sea change in how the territory conceptualized public safety. This evolution was not an easy transition. It was a response born of necessity, a realization that the modern world and the modern criminal were capable of penetrating even the most remote traditional boundaries. By embracing forensic science as the final arbiter of truth, the authorities in American Samoa transformed their capability to combat malice, ensuring that they were no longer simply reacting to the immediate aftermath of a crime, but actively and scientifically building a fortress of evidence that could withstand the most vigorous of legal challenges. This systemic refinement is the structural monument to Wyatt Bowles Jr., a functional, living testament to the fact that his death forced the evolution of an entire society, making it more resilient, more professional, and more profoundly capable of safeguarding the future against the potential for similar internal threats. Yet, beyond the mechanics of the law and the science of the laboratory, the most enduring aspect of this case is its profound social and psychological resonance. The community of American Samoa demonstrated an extraordinary level of collective strength in the aftermath of the murder, choosing to process their trauma through a lens of principled unity rather than succumbing to the corrosive influence of suspicion or fractured interpersonal relations. The way the people of the islands navigated the period of uncertainty, the trial, and the final conviction of Richard Modger remains a powerful, quiet lesson in the potential for human solidarity to overcome the most destabilizing of events. They chose to honor the victim by maintaining the integrity of their daily lives, by continuing to value the connections that define their culture, and by collectively rejecting the destructive, dehumanizing logic of the killer. This social resilience is a silent, ongoing affirmation of the sanctity of human life, an assertion that the values of the community are not fragile, but are instead deeply rooted in a mutual, protective awareness that is always, ever present, acting as an invisible shield for one another. In reflecting upon the convicted murderer, Richard Modger, it becomes clear that his life is now, and will forever be, defined by the total loss of the very autonomy he sought to preserve. The imposition of a 50-year, no parole sentence is the final, definitive response of the law to a transgression that fundamentally violated the moral compact of the territory. His existence within the prison system is not a measure of time, but a permanent, static testament to the consequences of moral abandonment. There is no possibility of redemption or reintegration because the act he committed was a total, absolute rejection of the humanity of another. His case serves as the ultimate, chilling benchmark for the limits of societal tolerance, an uncompromising boundary that asserts that no individual, regardless of their past or their perceived social standing, can act with such cruelty and remain a member of the human community. The permanence of his isolation is the mirror image of the finality of his crime, a cold, hard, and immutable fact that ensures that he will never again walk the paths of the island he once betrayed. The story of Wyatt Bowles Jr. also invites a broader, more philosophical contemplation regarding the concept of justice in the modern age. We often, and quite understandably, desire justice to be swift, cathartic, and emotionally satisfying. Yet the reality, as demonstrated in this case, is that true justice is often a slow, agonizingly deliberate, and profoundly technical process. It requires the sacrifice of time, the emotional investment of an entire community, and the persistent application of scientific rigors that often seem disconnected from the visceral, immediate pain of the loss. However, it is precisely this distance, this objectivity, and this procedural patience that give the law its power and its legitimacy. The fact that the process took 3 years to reach a conclusion does not diminish the gravity of the result. It enhances it, because it proves that the justice served was not a product of momentary emotion, but a result of a comprehensive, unwavering, and unimpeachable pursuit of the truth. This is the profound lesson that we must carry forward, that the path to a just outcome is inherently demanding, and that the integrity of our judicial institutions depends entirely upon our collective willingness to endure that path, to prioritize the facts over the feelings, and to ensure that the truth is always, above all else, the final deciding factor. As we look toward the horizon, the memory of this event continues to shape the character of American Samoa, acting as a quiet, protective, and ever-present guardian of the territory's core values. The community has not forgotten the horror of 2003, but they have successfully transformed it into a source of enduring, vigilant strength. They have moved forward, not by ignoring the past, but by integrating the lesson of the past into the foundation of their future. The story is now an essential, unalterable component of the island's heritage, a narrative that is shared with a sense of sobriety and respect, ensuring that the life of Wyatt Bowles Jr. remains a cherished, essential part of the community's collective identity. The legacy is one of light, of triumph, and of the realization that no matter how deep the shadows cast by the most extreme manifestations of human malice, the light of human decency, when protected by the law and bolstered by the truth, will always, ultimately, serve as the final guiding force for our shared existence. We conclude this retrospective with the absolute, profound certainty that the story of Wyatt Bowles Jr. and Richard Modger has reached its final, true, and definitive end in the annals of justice. The murder was a tragedy that devastated a community, but the subsequent pursuit of the truth was an act of profound restoration, a process that allowed the territory to reclaim its sense of peace and reaffirm its commitment to the dignity of human life. The case stands as an enduring, solemn monument to the fact that when a community stands together in the face of the most extreme adversity, when it refuses to be silenced by the fear of the dark, and when it remains steadfast in its demand for the truth, it can achieve a measure of justice that is as permanent, as clear, and as undeniable as the rising of the sun. The final, resonant takeaway is that the light of truth and the integrity of justice are the only forces that can ever provide true closure in the face of such deep, existential trauma. As the island continues its journey in the expansive, beautiful, and sometimes unforgiving reaches of the Pacific, it does so with the strength, the clarity, and the unshakable moral resolve that was forged in the heat of this tragedy, ensuring that the sanctity of human life remains, forever and always, the highest, most protected, and most sacred value of all. The light of justice, having been fought for with such persistence, now shines over the territory as a permanent, guiding beacon, a testament to the reality that in the long, arduous, and sometimes incredibly painful journey of our shared existence, the only path that can truly lead us toward the light is the path of the truth, pursued with integrity, courage, and an unwavering, final commitment to the preservation of our common humanity.